Sihun, welcome to the Korea Deconstructed podcast. The first question I have for you, like in any other country, this is a really easy question, but in Korea, it's kind of weird. How old are you?
Yeah, that's a question that gets me every time too,
Mm,
uh, because there's a difference between our Korean age and what I like to call the American age,
I like to
that we
call it the
have.
British age, but you can call it.
Okay, British age. But yeah, so I always have to think about it for a couple of seconds as well. But I was born in 2005,
Hmm.
so personally, I like to go with the younger version of my age. I think that works well usually. So
Mm,
um, my birthday's past, so that would actually be 17 years old now.
17. So you're absolutely right. It is weird because in Korea you can have up to three different ages, and my kids, they know that if I ask them in English or if I ask them in Korean, they'll give a different age according to the language
Ah,
that's used. So just very quickly, they've announced that they're going to change this aging system. And official documents now in Korea are going to use, let's call it international age. I know you like
yeah.
American age, but any thoughts on that? Is this a good sign? Are we losing some element of what it means to be Korean, or?
Well, I think it's you can look at it in both ways. Personally, coming from a background where I'm studying at an international school,
Hmm.
so usually I do end up interacting much more with people from other countries than I would normally interact with as just an average Korean person or average Korean student.
Hmm.
So I do think I'm personally a bit biased to prefer standardizing the age across countries. That I think that would just make things a lot easier for people, especially because Korea, as we, it's not unique to Korea. The entire world is globalizing. We're interacting with more people around the world. I
Hmm.
think that just makes it easier for other people to also understand Korea better.
Hmm.
When you don't have to pause for, like 5 minutes to explain this is the way that we do age in Korea.
Yeah. Yeah, because you do have to pause. That's why
Yeah.
it's one of those questions. Okay, but you're 17, you're 2005. Now, from this kind of like personal wage, in terms of generation, I hear lots of talk these days about like generation Z, millennials, boomers, and like MZs. They're all a little bit confusing for me, these terms. Do any of these terms mean anything to you? And do you describe yourself or do you categorize yourself as one of these particular generations? How does that work, Sihun?
Yeah, I think the difference between generations is really something that I think is explored and used a lot more by the media, more so
Mm,
than, average people. Like when I'm talking with my friends or when I'm talking with teachers, the first question that we ask isn't what generation do you belong to,
mm,
right? It's usually, just those basic details. What's your name? What's your age? Um, and I think the way that we categorize different generations is also a little bit, from my point of view, a little bit problematic
mm,
in the sense that, one of the terms that I think is used a lot here in Korea is the MZ generation,
right.
which basically groups two generations together, the millennials and Generation Z, which, if you think about it, is actually a really large group of people across a very broad range of age groups.
Hmm.
And to say that, MZ group, they're all relatively young, so they must have similar characteristics and they come from similar backgrounds, I think sort of ignores that diversity within that age group and within that so-called MZ generation. Um, and even amongst Generation Z people, for example, I was actually talking with some of my friends very recently,
Mm,
and one of the things that was brought up was, oh, one of my friends met this village schooler or elementary school student
mm,
who grew up after Gangnam Style, and we were like, how is that possible?
right.
Um, and so I think there are these differences even amongst quote unquote young people, that I think we need to recognize that, average day Koreans or average day people, we realize those differences exist, but they aren't labeled um, properly through those generation labels.
Absolutely. And I think, according to some classifications, like I'm a millennial, I think. I was born 1981. So, like, to have this MZ
Yeah.
it's such a huge span of time. And I know what you mean by people growing up after Gangnam Style. This will mean nothing to you. But a while ago, I spoke to somebody and I said, man, this is just like Bill and Ted. And the person looked at me and was like, David, what's Bill and Ted? And I suddenly felt so old. Sihoon, these terms, so I see MZ in Korean newspapers all the time.
Yeah.
Is that what is used? Are there other terms? We spoke about this idea of international age and Korean age. Is it the same in the international media or international conversations and Korean conversations? Are the same words being used? Do you find any differences in the nuances? Or is this like a more global categorization of young people?
I think it's because the way that the term Generation MZ or the MZ generation is used here in Korea is usually in relation to politics. I think there is a general consensus across different countries and different cultures that there are certain political characteristics that differentiate between different generations of people. I think, usually just in terms of like stereotypes, we usually think of older people or older generations as being more conservative, and younger people as being relatively more progressive. I think the same applies here in Korea, where although, as I'm sure we'll probably get to a little bit later, there are some differences here in Korea, especially with some of the more recent elections, that might challenge that idea a little bit. But at least prior to those elections, that was also the general consensus here in Korea. Younger people tend to vote more progressive, more quote unquote left wing. And I think it's just that in Korea, we've decided to call that group of people the MZ generation. There are other terms that are used. For example, some newspapers also call them the 2030 세대, which is basically like the 2030 age group, which I think is a little bit more accurate in the sense that MZ generation would include people like me who haven't voted yet, or who can't vote yet. So do we really have that same level of impact in our national politics? There may be some debate in that regard, whereas people in their 20s and 30s, at the very least, they do get to vote. So there is a certain amount of political influence that they have in that regard. There's also more specifically when newspapers refer to age groups in relation to gender as well, such as 이대 남, which basically refers to people in their 20s who are male. So we start to specify those specific demographics within our society, which I think ends up being a lot more accurate than just that broad umbrella term of MZ generation, which I think actually includes like 1/3 of the Korean population. So that's a large number of people that we're just saying all have the same characteristics, all vote the same way, all think the same way.
Which is clearly not the case. Absolutely. Yeah. You said this thing about Gen Z or the 2030s, these people generally as a general characteristic associated with more progressive, let's say, political or social values.
Yes.
If we just try to expand that a little bit more broadly, what do you think are some of the images, the values, the associations, the ideas that are connected to Generation Z or these young people? I mean, is it just like progressive social values? And if so, what does that mean? Or is there more to it, Sihoon?
I think there's definitely a lot of different factors that come into play, especially when we're talking about generational differences, just because the environment that people grow up in are are very different between generations. Even over the course of a single year, you can have like new technological innovations that completely change the environment that people grow up in, the educational environment, the social environment, even the cultural environment. So, for example, the technology that people in my age group grew up with versus the technology that people maybe who were born this year are going to grow up with is probably going to look extremely different.
Mm-hmm.
I know one of the things that I remember, I have a younger sister who's 3 years younger than me. And 3 years isn't that big of a difference, but one of the things I remember is when my sister was growing up, I think in elementary school,
Mm.
she had something called a kid's phone, which is this like mini, almost like Apple Watch looking kind of phone device that didn't exist when I was growing up. So I was like, what's that? So even those kind of small differences that may not seem as significant, um, those have an impact in the age that's people are exposed to those types of technologies, what they can do with those types of technologies.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's really with Generation Z, it's all about technology. I don't want to say that everyone's exactly the same. Obviously, even within Generation Z, there are going to be some people who maybe a little bit more old-fashioned, or other people who may be really strong advocates of using more technology and more innovations, who are really into coding. So I think there are some differences, but you can't deny the fact that this is the environment that people are growing up in.
Mm.
And whatever your reaction to that environment is, it is an outcome and a product of that environment that you grew up in.
Sure. Yeah, you grow up as digital natives and these things
Yeah.
are all around you. I had to adapt to the internet as it became part of our lives. When you say technology plays a really important role, is that just like using technology? I mean, like your generation, do you have any thoughts on metaverse and NFTs and coding? Because these are the buzzwords, right? And fourth
Yeah.
industrial revolution. And my nephew, he goes to pretty good high school here, and they sometimes do like seminars in metaverse things, and he walks around inside this space. I think the graphics look terrible, Sihun. I don't know what's going on. It looks like some old 1990s Doom game or something. But does technology? Can you give us some insight into like this metaverse NFTs? Is that what you mean, or is it different?
I mean, metaverse, NFTs, Bitcoin, all of those things are definitely part of that category of technology.
Mm.
But I think it's also a lot of other things. For example,
Mm.
Korea, I think, is unique in the sense that we're basically like the home country of one of the largest electronics companies in the world, Samsung. And I think that creates a very I think that creates a very different environment as well, compared to, for example, someone growing up in a country like Japan, where
Mm.
their companies focus on a lot of other things of very different categories, like Sony and um, that or Nintendo. They grew up in a very different environment. Samsung focuses on completely different aspects of technology.
Mm.
So as a person growing up in Korea, I think devices like phones, computers, even like TVs, um, people are much more interested in those things and
Mm-hmm.
much more interested in what's going on in that particular market, in that particular industry,
Mm.
compared to, for example, another industry that may be also technologically related and kind of on the rise, but isn't so relevant to a domestic company or like a
Mm-hmm.
Korean company,
Mm.
which it's a little bit hard to find something like that here in Korea, just because there are a lot of companies that do IT and do technology. You look at cars, and you have Hyundai, and you have like even games. Esports is a really big thing here in
Yeah,
Korea.
man.
So
Yeah.
Yes, I think Koreans we're kind of unique in that we really like technology and we really like IT and we really are interested in innovation. And I
Hmm.
think a part of that is really, if you look at Korea, it's a relatively small country with a relatively small population. There aren't a lot of natural resources here in Korea.
Mm.
So one of the things that a lot of people like to credit as having contributed to Korea's success economically is that technological innovation and kind of seizing those opportunities. So I think in a lot of Koreans' minds, that's still a very big factor, especially as our economy has, obviously the economic growth of our country has been kind of going down
Hmm.
relative to what some people might consider to have been kind of the prime of Korean kind of innovation and industrial development. So people are kind of looking towards the next big thing. I think is a term that's really used a lot, not just in Korea, but around the world. What's
Mm.
going to be that next big thing that we can invest in, that we can really seize um, to strengthen our country?
I want to ask you about the future in the minute, Sihun, but when you're talking about Samsung and technology, um, I noticed, maybe it's just among sort of my generation, that people always either have a Samsung or an iPhone. Like it's one of these. I heard somebody say to me the other day, if somebody doesn't have an iPhone, I wouldn't date them. I was like, wow, me personally, I like Samsung because you can break the phones and you get no adverts and you can put ad blocks and things like that. So I'm all about that kind of stuff. Among your generation, is like, do you notice any tendencies like the iPhones are cool or the Samsungs, or you get what happens with that, Sihun?
I mean, I think that's a debate that transcends age levels. Um,
Yeah.
I know that's something that a lot of my friends like to debate about as well, especially whenever the new iPhone comes out or the new Samsung phone comes out. It's like,
Mm.
I have this new Samsung phone. It's better than like your old iPhone from like 3 years ago. I'm personally also on the side of Samsung, but I know some of my friends are iPhone users, and I think a lot of people who prefer iPhones, I think what they argue is, it looks better, the design is kind of smoother.
Yeah.
I think it's really at that point, it's just a matter of personal opinion.
Hmm.
I do think, as Koreans, people tend to prefer Samsung just because it's a Korean company. But I don't think it's to the point that, I would say all Koreans love Samsung. I think it's pretty evenly split here as well.
Sure, sure, sure. Now, one of the things you said to me, Sihun, was that the media likes to use MZ terms and things like that. And I think you're absolutely correct. There's a lot of times I see in, articles and media about like 3포 세대 and 헬조선 and
Yeah,
MZ generation. And when I speak to Korean people, they're like, we never use those words. They're like nice terms that sociologists make
yeah.
up, right? So when you and people your age are hanging out and talking about things and what interests you, like, and I know you're not representative of the whole of
Yeah.
Korea, but what is it? So you've mentioned technology. Like, what else? What are the kind of interests, the values? What's going on in the minds and ideas of people your age, Sihun?
I think the really interesting thing that or at least I personally find it very interesting, is that I think young people are starting to care about politics as well. Politics and sort of culture, our society.
Mm.
Um, and the reason I say that that's interesting is, you know, um, if you look at kind of Korea as a whole, just like over the last couple of decades, um, really, I would say that Korea's main focus and the main focus of Koreans as a whole has been primarily economic,
Mm.
um,
Mm.
especially after the Korean War, which, I think we like to talk about that as something that's kind of way back in the past, but something that I think, especially as a Korean, you're constantly reminded of is, no, wait, actually, if you go back, even like three generations or four generations, uh, they were people who actually experienced those events directly.
Mm,
Um, and even afterwards, we had like several military dictatorships. So I think it was really all about how can we survive, um, rather than how can we improve our government system to make it more democratic or to provide better social welfare,
mm,
um, which I guess you could call that sort of um, the concerns that only a developed country can have. And I think now that we're starting to kind of enter that phase of Korea being a relatively developed country, we have a pretty stable economy. A lot of Korean people are starting to look past, economic growth, although that
mm,
is still a major factor, and look more towards how can we improve our society, how can we address these social issues in our society. And I think that's also one of the reasons why a lot of the social issues that we're talking about right now weren't really talked about as much. If we go back even just a couple of years, like the gender issue
mm.
is a really sort of modern debate that we've started to have here in Korea. It was always an issue, but it wasn't this much of an issue that
Mhm.
really could kind of sway entire elections outcomes. Same thing with like housing prices is another major social issue here in Korea, which is also a very recent development where you know young people now are at a point where they have the capacity to kind of engage in those economic activities.
Mm,
So those problems in our society that prevent them from doing that become much more apparent,
mm.
and they have the power to kind of voice that opinion and voice their concerns. And I think that's really changed from the past, even just a decade ago. So I think, and growing up in that time period, obviously as teenagers, we can't really vote, and we aren't like out there trying to buy houses right now ourselves, but
Mm.
we do recognize those issues, and we're starting to care about that as well, because in just a couple of years, that's going to be us too. So how can we prepare for that?
I think it's really interesting that you have that historical perspective, Sihun, because the first challenge for South Korea after the Korean War or its establishment was economic development. And then the next challenge was democratization. And now
Yes.
you're so, and you needed the economic development to get the democratization. And then
Yeah.
now you've got the democratization, you have freedom to express your opinions and do various things, and also the economic stability to a certain extent, which is good. So when you talk about now you have this kind of, it's your turn to do something with Korea, are you positive about it? I know there's a lot of talk sometimes we get in the media about young people not having hope. It's hard to get jobs. It's hard to get on the housing, to get a house. We hear talk about like 3포세대, M포세대, like giving up these things.
Yeah.
But you've highlighted like a fight or a mission. Are you confident about that? Do you see it playing out? How do you see this next stage of South Korea's development and your role in it?
Well, I think the best way to describe it would be cautious optimism.
Mm,
I think I don't think we can completely ignore the issues that we're facing. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges and a lot of obstacles. You know, if the last presidential election has shown us anything, it's that we're facing the exact same issues that basically any other or every other really democratic country in the world right now is facing,
mm,
which is polarization, social issues that we can't somehow seem to find a compromise for. We're really living in a very divided age, I think. Um, that said, I think it's another thing is I remember a couple of years ago, I think this was back in 2016, right after Donald Trump was elected to be the next American president. One of my teachers at our school asked me, Seeing, what do you think is one of the reasons for this, what was then, sudden rise of conservatism
Hmm.
in the world? And similarly, in Europe, there was an increase in nationalism and anti-Semitism at the time, and populism.
Brexit.
Um, yeah. So, and so I think one of the things that we talked about was, yes, there is this rise, but if you think about it to a certain extent, there is also, such a thing as a political cycle, I think, where, different ideologies kind of have a certain level of dominance at different points in time. Like nationalism, that's not a new concept necessarily. That's existed throughout history. It's just been called different things, and it's just been dominant at certain different periods of time. Same thing with more democratic values. It's just the way that they manifest in our present day, and how much power they have, um, and how much support those different ideologies have from the people. So I think it's something very similar right now, where yes, we do seem to be pretty divided. But then at the same time, you could ask, when was humanity ever not divided? It's always a constant debate. It's a constant, you know, conflict, and in some ways, that conflict is what drives progress. Um, it's just, I think, a matter of the way that we approach that conflict, our attitude, and
Mm.
engaging in that discussion and in that debate. Whether we are willing to find a common area, find common ground, find that gray area that we can all agree on. Um, and I think that's sort of the part that's been relatively lacking in some of the more recent political discourse. So I think once we can find that attitude again, as a society, once we can recover that mindset,
Mm.
I think we'll be good to go.
Yeah, cautious optimism is good. That's a nice way to have it. The Korean economist Hajun Chang, he often quotes the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci by saying, and I'll probably get it a little bit wrong, but I paraphrase by saying, "I'm a cynic of my mind, but an optimist of my soul." You know, when you when
Yeah.
you when you think about it logically, well, there's problems, but deep down you have this kind of optimism, and yeah, that kind of unity and realizing you're on the same side, that you may have disagreements, but you're all on the same side here,
Yeah.
essentially, aren't we? I mean, we want good things. I want to come to politics in a bit because you sent me lots of articles about politics, and I heard your questions at the Brazilian embassy. It's obviously something you have a great passion for. But before we get there, can I ask you, Sihun, about identity?
Yes.
Because the importance of identity seems to be changing. When I grew up, identity was kind of flattened, and you weren't meant to pay attention to somebody's identity, the color of the skin. We were told just treat everybody the same. That was, the message. Identity has changed in how we're meant to pay attention. You mentioned more idenams and things like this.
Mm.
In Korea, has identity become a big thing? Have you noticed any changes there, or it's not a big a deal as we sometimes perhaps see online? Or how is identity working for your generation here in Korea, Sihun?
I think the thing with identity is um, it's something that I think, at least from my generation and from my experiences, it's something that we need to recognize.
Mm.
I think that's sort of the shift, or the main difference, I would say. We don't ignore identity or ignore those differences between people.
Mm.
And I think, there are pros and cons, obviously, to different approaches and different ways of looking at identity. But I personally would say, you know, people are different, and they have different experiences. They come from different backgrounds. They have different identities. And I think, um, really, we are losing out on a lot of potential, diversity, and a lot of potential progress if we try and ignore all of that,
Mm.
and standardize everything and say everyone's exactly the same. Uh, And I think that's kind of the main difference between the difference between the concept of equality and equity. I think is
Mm.
something that's really talked about a lot, at least at my school and with some of the other people that I've talked to. Is we're not trying to say everyone's exactly the same, and we're all carbon copies of this one template. We're all different. It's just how can we promote that difference in a way that's not divisive.
Mm.
I think that's kind of the main thing here, where, you know, for example, looking at the example of Korea and Korean people, identity, I think, is a very big factor for a lot of Koreans. Even sometimes, I speak to people who say, no, I don't think that's a very big factor. I don't look at race or I don't look at gender.
Mm.
But then, the moment, for example, Japanese prime minister says Tokyo is Japanese, you're gonna see a lot of Koreans not happy with that.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden it's like, I thought you didn't look at, your national identity. I thought so I think it's really kind of looking at Koreans. We are very much impacted and influenced by our identity. At
Mm.
the same time, I think there is a difference between the way that Koreans, as individuals and as real life people, are affected by our identity versus the way that the media or that politicians might try and use identity to impact people. For example, I think the gender issue, that's something that most Koreans, I don't think, would say that that's a very big part of our identity, in
Mm.
that you're male, so that's the path you need to follow, or you're female, so that's the path that you need to follow. Yes, there are certain stereotypes. Obviously, in Korea, still there is some discrimination. I think you can't really deny that in any country and in any culture and society. But I do think, especially with the younger people, it's more about what the government does to try and differentiate between genders that people are reacting negatively to,
Mm.
rather than our gender or our identity. So if you look at the news, it's always, for example, young Korean men being angered by something that the government's proposing to do, that will somehow distinguish between Korean females and Korean males. Or similarly, it's you know women's rights organizations criticizing the government for doing something that's divisive, that's intentionally trying to divide between women and men. And I think it's really about the interference
Hmm.
of the government and of those organizations that make us think that there is a difference in our identities, and the way that those identities shape the way that we behave and the way that we act.
Why do you think they do it, these governments? Are they malevolently, playing games? Let's put these two against each other and watch them fight. Or why do you think this takes place? Because I agree with you, by the way, Suhun. I see that division being created by statements and media and things like that. Why do you think it happens?
Well, I think um, I don't think there is any one answer that justifies that behavior for everyone.
Hmm.
I think different people have different reasons, and different groups have different reasons for doing what they're doing and for saying what they're saying.
Mm.
For example, I'm sure there are politicians who, it's coming from what they truly believe is an issue in our country. And sometimes, that they may be correct. I think there were definitely instances where a politician or some, figure said something, and you'll see that people agree with what they're saying. And I think that's really the best way to differentiate between divisive statements and
Mm.
statements that are actually made because those people care about what they're saying and care about those social issues, is you'll see that reflected in the way that people react to those statements. I think an example I can think of is with like the nth room event or case that happened. You know, basically the entire Korean population was like, no, that's a bad thing. We need to address that properly. You're not going to see Korean men, for example, saying, no, like you're discriminating against Korean men by investigating that case. You're not going to see that. And politicians who speak up about that case, you know, they were praised by people. They were said, you know, the people agreed with what they were saying and what they were doing to address that issue. Other times when you see these divisive statements, and I think to a certain extent, you know, it's sort of 50-50 split between people who are kind of doing it for political reasons. I think we can't, you know, as much as we would like for that to not be the case, I think it's impossible to deny that there are some people who kind of use it for their personal advantage and to intentionally sort of create that division. I think that was really the case, for example, in the Korean presidential election recently.
Yeah.
A lot of that, I think, came from trying to get votes, which I think, you know, it's an unfortunate side effect of democratic elections, I think, is, you know, they need to win votes. They're going to have to appeal to people to get votes. And if there's an issue that divides people, you know, it's going to divide people. And it's very hard to sort of avoid that issue. But at the same time, like I said, I think there are the majority of the cases are situations where people are either saying what they truly believe to be right or to be just based on their personal values and beliefs. Or I think it's sometimes what people think is what the population wants and what the voters or the electorate wants to happen, which, you know, there can be a disconnect between politicians and the people they represent, or the media and the people that and their audience. I think that's oftentimes the case with these kinds of issues, is they don't really fully understand what exactly it is that people want changing and want happening in the government. So they kind of half understand it, half don't understand it. They misinterpret what the people want. So they end up with something that's really not helping anybody. And I think that creates even more division. So I think that's really one of the main issues, is the lack of communication.
Right. And, you know, sometimes when I look at real life conversations in university seminars and lectures that I do with young Korean adults in their 20s, and they generally agree on most things. Of course, they have different opinions. There's no one thing. But, you know, you mentioned the nth room incident and the crimes that took place there. You know, on certain issues, most of the young people, they agree, like, this is right and this is wrong. There might be some other issues where it's debatable, but I think they're all coming to it generally with, you know, positive and generally rather liberal attitudes, just because that's their generation. I don't see a lot of whereas when I see in the media or certain politicians, it's very divisive and it's a little bit devoid or distant from what I experience in real life sometimes. Do you think young people, I mean, we talked about this at the start, but one of the conversations that comes up or you'll see online is that young Koreans have become conservative. They're shifting conservative, they're going incels, there's alt-right, all these American terms, which I personally don't find very useful for Korean politics, but it gets a lot of traction in the press, especially in the English language press.
Yes.
Do you see any elements of that in real life? Is it fringe? It's not really there? What's your take on that part of it, Si-hoon? Is there a shift to the right among the young people?
Yeah. Firstly, I think I definitely agree with you. Those aren't really terms that I think represent Korean politics or apply to Korean politics as well as they do maybe in another country's politics. And I also read like articles from different news sources, English news sources about Korean politics, and sometimes I'm like, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't
Mm.
think, or at least there's room for people to misunderstand what's going on
You're not talking
here in
about my
Korea.
articles, are you? See him
No, I'm not.
there.
I think
I'm
your
sorry.
article is a pretty good job. Um, I think yes. So um, I think the important thing to realize is, we say young people are going, quote unquote, going conservative or turning conservative or becoming conservative, but I think it's really not as black and white as kind of the way that a lot of people try and understand it. And I think it's also one of the characteristics of young people here in Korea and maybe in other parts of the world as well, is that we're not, especially when it comes to politics, we're not as loyal to one side. So it's not like once you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat forever, or once you're um, in the Conservative Party, which changes their name quite a lot.
Yeah.
Once you're on their side, you're a conservative for life. That's not the case with young people. Even over the course of just a couple of months, you can switch from one party to another. Um, and so I think it's really a question of what are these parties doing to either attract or push away young people.
Mm.
That's more so the question than rather than are young people more progressive or conservative here in Korea. And if you really and if you look at Korean politics as well, the difference between like the two main parties here in Korea when it comes to like which one's more liberal, which one's or and progressive, which one's more conservative, there's actually not that much difference, I find. Yeah, especially if you compare it to like countries like America, where
Mm.
I think there's a lot of issues that really divide the Republican Party and the Democratic Party there in America. Here in Korea, you look at like the Democratic Party of Korea, the People Power Party, uh, they actually agree on a lot of things, which I think is pretty surprising. Like, for example, if you look at environmental issues, that's something that I would say the two parties pretty much agree on most of the time.
Mm.
Maybe they might have differences in terms of how they want to approach the issue, but they agree that it's an issue. They agree that it's backed by science. Um, and they agree that we need to address it. So it's really just a couple of issues like the gender issue, housing prices, those issues that are differentiating between these two parties. And so I wouldn't say, young people are turning conservative just because more of them support the quote unquote conservative party
Mm.
in this particular election. And in fact, in the most recent presidential election, a lot of that support went down as well compared to the previous mayoral election that we had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think it's much less of a clear cut, they've become conservative or they've become progressive. It's they agree with that particular party on this issue that's been highlighted by the media.
Mm.
So they voted for that particular party this time, but you have absolutely no idea who they're going to vote for next time. And it's all dependent on those issues. It's dependent on what those parties do to try and attract those people in a way that by focusing on issues that young people actually care about.
Mm. That's that you could see as a really positive sign, Sihoon, if it's like the end of ideology in Korea,
Mm.
that it's not always this side or that side, but it's dependent on the issues and the solutions presented, and that might be a good thing. And I completely agree with you in terms of that. The main ruling party and opposition party, they're about to change in a week
Yes.
or so, but I mean, sometimes I see a lot of reporters in the English press frame the Democratic Party and as the progressives, And I don't get that language. I'm not sure. This is no disrespect to them. They can be whatever they want. But like, to frame one of them as the progressive and one of them as the conservative, that doesn't make sense to me, because they both seem to agree on a lot of things. I mean, it's weird to me. And that's why you need to understand the Korean politics. They disagree on North Korea heavily. Yes. That's one of the big issues that they seem to divide on. A lot of the others they will agree on. So what people do hold up as the Progressive Party, and by progressive we mean representing minorities, standing up for gay rights, trying to be liberal, representing women. From Western Europe, this is what we would call the left, right?
Yes.
In the recent election, the Justice Party, held by Shim Sang-jang, they got about, memory now, 800,000 votes. It's like 2%. And that had dropped from 2 million 5 years ago.
Yes.
And if you looked at that, you could say, wow, the country's becoming less progressive. But I don't think that's the case. So why does the one progressive party fare so badly?
Yeah, I think it's in this particular presidential election, the situation and the circumstances surrounding the elections were obviously very different from 5 years ago when we had the 2017 elections. Back then it was right after the previous president had been impeached, Park Geun-hye, and obviously she was from the conservative party, or the quote-unquote conservative party. Back then we also had 5 major candidates, which doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. You look at not just Korea but other countries as well. It's very rare to see a presidential election where there are 5 major candidates in the running.
It's a good thing, isn't it? It seemed to me when I saw that there was choice, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that's much better than having just a straight up 2-party system, which is kind of what most countries have. So I agree with you. That's a good thing, but it's also a very rare thing. And I think in this election, we kind of started to go back to what we normally have, which is that 2-party system of one major sort of relatively more left-wing party and another that's relatively a little bit more right-wing. And I think especially in this election, one of the things that came up was I think even just a week before the actual day of the election, we had An Chul-soo as another third-party candidate running, and then he formed a coalition, he merged with the conservative candidate, who ended up winning, and so a lot of the people who supported sort of the left-wing side of politics, or maybe who were, I guess it would be better to phrase it as people who are opposed to President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol as being elected. A lot of them consolidated towards the candidate that had the higher chance of winning, which was obviously the candidate from the larger and more established political party. And I think it's so I think that's definitely probably the main reason why the Progressive Party, the Justice Party, ended up losing a lot of votes compared to the previous election, was that their candidate just wasn't strong enough to beat the opposition conservative candidate. So a lot of people consolidate their votes, and it ended up just being a one-on-one race, essentially. So I think it's not really showing that the country is becoming any more or less progressive or conservative. It's just kind of going back to normal. In fact, if anything, I think it's showing that we're, very split. Like I said earlier, the election outcome was really close. So I think it's just a question of how can we sort of modernize our politics a little bit so that we can incorporate more ideas and more perspectives and have that diverse range in terms of our political spectrum,
Mm.
so that we can um, simulate something a little bit closer to what we had in the 2017 elections, which, as you mentioned, it's a little bit more ideal, especially for the democracies to have that those diverse perspectives being represented in government.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think that's kind of the way to go. It's just a question of how do we get there uh, at this point.
There are definitely legal changes taking place. For example, the last presidential election, it was 18, like high school people could vote for the
Yes,
first time, right? And they've also lowered the age at which people can join political parties and run.
yes,
So there are these legal changes taking place. What I found interesting about the Progressive Party here was that in running Madam Shin, they had the oldest candidate. And I
yeah,
was kind of like, you're the Progressive Party. Like, you know, if you're going to lose, at least put some youth in there and give them experience, right? Pass over the torch. When we look around the world, we do see some countries. It might be New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern, or Finland and Estonia, I believe, have also got, you know, young politicians taking
yes.
power at the age of 30 odd. Chile has just done it as well, I believe, a 30-year-old. Is there room for youth in Korean politics? I mean, genuine room for youth, or is it going to be, because in Korea we generally associate the society with this kind of the old people rule, and there's this kind
Yeah,
of Getung, there's this hierarchy and Confucianism and all that kind of stuff.
yes.
Is there genuine room for youth in Korean politics, or will it just be used as like another tool to say, look, we've got a young person in our team, you should vote for us, but really they're just a token to
Yeah.
attract people? Is there room for people like you, Sihun?
I think I think there's definitely more room than we used to have before. But at the same time, I think something that personally I found a little bit concerning is uh, what you just described, which is political parties trying to basically have these young people, like one or two young people in their political party, and saying, "Hey, we represent young people now, or we represent, Generation MZ."
Mm.
Again, which is like a really large age group. Um, and oftentimes, I think a recent example was with regards to the Democratic Party here in Korea. A couple months ago, they appointed a young female person as to a secretary position in the Blue House, as like one of the highest ranking government officials.
Mm.
And a lot of people, I think I remember, were very critical of that sort of move. They, recognized it as sort of the Democratic Party's response to the Conservative Party electing the youngest party leader in Korean history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so
Mm.
I think, it's those kind of differences where is it actual progress, or is it just pretending to make progress? Um, and I think, especially in Korea, like you said, it's really, there is that sort of age level hierarchy in our society. I do think that's starting to fade a little bit, but it's still very much there. Uh, Another very important thing that a lot of people, believe, and I think it's a very popular idea here in Korea, is meritocracy. Like,
Yeah.
you get what you deserve. You have to have
Yeah.
experience. You have to have qualifications. So I think that's another big thing that's um, in some way blocking progress, or at least blocking opportunity for younger people to enter politics and to be in those positions of leadership. Because
Mm.
obviously, if you're a younger person, uh, just in terms of net experience, you've had less years to try out different things and to be in positions of leadership. And I think the problem there is that idea of having enough experience and having enough qualifications is just as popular with young people as it is with older people. So in some ways, it's also young people who are blocking opportunity for other young people to be in positions of leadership, which is just, it's sort of the way that, Korean culture is shaped. And obviously, I'm not saying it's something that's wrong or something that's bad. I want my, politicians to be experienced and to know what they're doing.
Mm,
But yeah, so I think, we're trying to experiment with these different things. I think the case of the People Power party leader Lee Jun-suk being elected, I think that was one of the more successful instances of young people in positions of leadership where people can agree, they had the qualifications and they had the legitimacy to be in that position of leadership. People recognize that. Um, and so I think it's really trying to make more opportunities for stuff like that to happen, where we are able to recognize the advantages of having young people in positions of government
mm.
and in leadership positions, so that we can diversify that sort of diversify Korean politics a little bit. And I think this is just my personal opinion, but I think one of the ways that we can possibly start doing that is with the new president. When he's forming his cabinet, I was personally a little bit disappointed. I think the average age was somewhere around like the late 50s
Yeah,
or like the
yeah.
high 50s and like early 60s, pretty old. So I think, that's something that maybe can be improved is we can start out with those positions, uh, especially those positions that are designed to sort of address young people, or that I guess would a lot of people might consider to be the expertise of younger people,
Mm.
like in fields like IT and technological development, or there are those specific government positions that are dedicated to connecting with younger people. You know, those people I think should be young people in those positions.
Yeah.
Um, so I think starting there would be a good first step.
Absolutely. Culture ministries as well. The people dealing with
Yes.
Hallyu and soft power, like, don't put 60-year-old Ajoshis in that
Yeah.
department. They just don't, they'll never get it. Um, you mentioned this idea that hierarchy is lowering in the importance of it in South Korea. And while I agree with you, just for some listeners, perhaps, that are not quite aware, Sihoon, if this conversation was taking place in Korean, it would be very different, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Like
it
how
would be.
it would be so, the amount of deference that if you go into Korean, if someone's a professor, someone's a student, it changes the dynamics completely. And I think for
Yes.
my aim going forward is I'll do season 2 of Korea Deconstructed. Hopefully it might be a long time in the future in Korean,
Mm,
but I think there is a real difference. And I think for people just listening to this only ever in English, whenever the conversation shifts to Korean, those power dynamics become immediately obvious in a lot of
yes.
conversations, right? We spoke about age and you spoke about meritocracy, and that's a really important thing. And,
Yeah.
people have been very upset what they see as the abuse of power, corruption, putting their children into positions of
Yes.
influence and faking diplomas and all of this. We'll probably come to that, but we mentioned that 18-year-olds were allowed to vote in this election,
Yes.
high school students. I talked about this a lot in various media spots, and the listeners and people that phoned in, they were kind of divided on it.
Mm,
Having spoken to you today, you're 17, you can't even vote yet. I'm like,
yeah.
give these people the vote. They know more about it than me. But what's your take on this about, is it right? Should it be that young? Should it be younger? Do you agree with this move? What's your take on lowering the age to 18 now?
Yeah, I think I mean I'm also divided on that issue. And I think the reason why people are so divided is just that there are such clear advantages and disadvantages to lowering the voting age. The advantage is obviously you are representing more people through your elections. It's
Yeah.
a better and more accurate reflection of what the population wants, and it's a more ideal version of democracy. At the same time, young people, especially like high school students, in Korea, they're busy enough studying for exams and studying for school.
So you
Now
don't
they have
want
to,
more homework, no more
yeah,
과제.
it's like you have to make out time to study politics, watch news, like read articles, and then go vote. It's a whole process. So the question is also, it's not like if you lower the voting age, people are automatically going to all go and vote. There's also the question of how much impact does that actually have in terms of, are these people actually going out and voting if we lower the voting age, or are they not voting so it doesn't actually end up making any difference? Um, so I think it's really that sort of, and I think this sort of ties back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of young people starting to care a little bit more about politics. I think that's good, and I think as long as that trend continues, lowering the voting age is definitely much more of an advantage than it is a disadvantage, because people are going to be informed. Even young people, even high school students, they're at least going to, go into the voting booth having a pretty solid sense of what they're voting for and the implications of their vote and why it matters. At the same time, if that trend doesn't continue, what I was talking about earlier in terms of people probably aren't going to end up voting in the first place. And those people who do vote, there is a high chance that, they might be misinformed about issues. They might not really know what's going on. Something that a concern that I've heard coming from a lot of people about that was also they might be influenced by like their parents or by their teachers who basically like tell them go and vote for this person, which in that case is that really representative of that student's personal values and beliefs, or is it just like copying and pasting their parents or their teachers' votes and duplicating that, which sort of undermines the whole purpose of lowering the voting age? So I guess it would kind of connect with, again, what the government can do about it. I think a very easy and sort of straightforward way of helping make elections and lowering the voting age more effective would be if we can incorporate more of those, more of that political discourse and sort of debate and exploring those ideas, that critical thinking into our education system. Then, obviously people are students are going to know what they can expect, which I think at this point right now in the Korean educational system, that's something that can be improved. So yeah, I think that would be the first step. Once we can achieve that, I think lowering the voting age is definitely that would definitely be a good thing.
But you're totally right to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Nothing's perfect. There's always going to be like a trade-off of what we do in these kind of things. And when you look at the results of the last election, you realize also that maybe about 65% of the people over 60 voted Conservative. And so while we talk about sort of low voting age rates, I often wonder, like, do we need high barriers as well? Not to count people out, but it's like, if we're lowering it at the bottom end, is there ever a top end? Or is like somebody's 114? Yeah, go ahead. It's all on once you're old.
Yeah.
You mentioned misinformation and education, so let's explore those a little bit, perhaps. Now, you're at a pretty special school. Yes. Shout out to Solomon for hooking this up.
Yes.
Chadwick International School. So I guess your experiences aren't going to be reflective of those over the whole country, but Korean education is a thing, man. Like, it's brutal. And so my niece is, I want to say she's 13, 14. And we're planning to go back to the UK in September for my brother's wedding. And she's 13, 14. They said she can't go because there's a midterm at 13, 14. And if she misses it, and this goes towards Suning, and it's like from such an early, and I was like, oh, come on. Everyone's like, no, David, this is serious. But from such an early age, right, this pressure is put on. It's a very intense thing. So can you give us some insight? So I know it might be limited in your own experiences, or it might be not. You might have friends in it, but What's Korean education like? Because in some ways, Sihoon, it's good. Korean students really clever. My son is 7. He explained photosynthesis to me. It's ridiculous. Like 7 years old, and the math compared to the math in the UK is like, it's huge, right? The difference is, so in some senses it's really good, it's really effective. In the other sense, it's suffocating, it's rote learning, memorization, no critical thinking. But I didn't go through it. What's your take on Korean education?
Yeah, I think I mean what you say is pretty much absolutely correct in terms of Korean education. You know, um, I think it's kind of going back to something that we talked about earlier in terms of the limitations of Korea as a country in terms of what we have. Uh,
Mm.
like, do we have natural resources? Not really. We're also, you know, I mean, we're like we have ports, but in terms of land, we're pretty much blocked by
Yeah.
North Korea. um, and we're also surrounded by what pretty powerful neighbors, China, Russia, Japan, even North Korea has a pretty strong international presence. So I think that's something that's really in the back of the minds of every Korean person is, in order for me to succeed and in order for our country to succeed, the only thing we can really do is increase the sort of quality. Uh, I don't want to phrase it like this because it sounds like we're objectifying people, but
Yeah.
increase the quality of human capital here in Korea. And the best way to do that is through education, and the most effective way to do that is really what we call 주입식 교육, which is basically just inserting knowledge into people. Um, and obviously that goes against a lot of I guess the values that people have normally in terms of social life. Obviously, we value creative thinking, we value critical thinking, and I think that's one of the main differences and one of the main advantages for my school as well, Chatter International School, because we have the IB curriculum, which emphasizes a lot of those elements of creativity and critical thinking, which is really different from the Korean public educational system.
Mm.
So I do have a lot of friends who go to Korean public schools or who went to public schools, and so if you speak with some of them about what's the main difference and sort of compare it with the education that we get here at Chatter International School or at other international schools in Korea, I'm sure uh, it's really the main difference between the emphasis that those particular curriculums place on a certain concept or idea. I think, to be honest, I don't think the level of education or the quality of the education changes all that much, or like the difficulty level. I
Mm.
think, what we learn, and to a certain extent, I think that's also part of Korean culture in the sense that, you can attend the international school, but chances are, especially if you're a Korean person, you're probably also attending academies and hagwons outside of school. And, even if you don't really learn those things at school and you're not tested, you still have that knowledge because you go to academies. So I think it's really, yeah, it's hard. I think it's hard because, you know, everyone recognizes the disadvantages of
Mm.
that particular educational system in that, Korea, is infamous for having very high suicide rates, especially amongst teenagers. I think
Mm.
one of the highest in the world. Um, and a large part of that is because of the extremely demanding educational system that we have. Um, and at the same time, if we let go of that and if we sort of abandon that educational system that we have, a concern for a lot of people, and this connects also with not just the educational culture, but also the workplace culture, working hard, working long hours. There's this idea that the more work you put in, the better outcome that you're going to have.
No,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So, whereas I would say with the IB curriculum, for instance, it's not so much about the number of hours you put in, as much as it is about what you can do in the number of hours that you have put in, which might not seem like a very big difference, but especially when it comes to education, it is a very big difference. And so I think it's something that we really need to try and transition out of slowly, especially now that Korea, like I said, is a pretty developed country. I don't think there's as much of a necessity for us to have that fast-paced, get work done and put immense amount of work for long hours. I don't think that's as necessary as it used to be before, maybe when our country wasn't as economically developed. When quantity, I would say, was more important than quality. Now that we're starting to transition out of that phase, we need to focus on quality. But to do that, we do need that transition phase. We need time to transition out, and we also need an alternative, because I think you can't just say, okay, like starting tomorrow, we're going to implement this foreign educational curriculum. That doesn't happen. It's a Korean education curriculum. Even if we are basing it off of a foreign educational curriculum or educational system, we need to change it and adjust it to fit Korea. So you need like Korean history, for example, Korean language courses. You're going to have to make those adjustments, and that takes time. There's probably going to be a lot of debate in that regard as well amongst people and politicians and professionals and professors. So I think the sooner we get started, the better.
And it's probably wise, Sihoon, that it's important that, when you talked about President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol's transition team, that it was all old people, that you have young people in these ministries that know the reality and know what's going on. So it's not just repeating the same old things, but they bring these new insights and allow those changes to take place at a speed that's reasonable. Because you're right, you can't just change things overnight, and you can't just copy paste things from other countries. You don't want to do that. You want new Korea rather than old other places. And it's so important. You keep mentioning, I guess, this kind of lack of resources. There are these ideas in the academic literature about this thing called the resource curse, which is countries that do have natural resources don't democratize or don't develop because the resources either get like America, like countries will come in and invade and steal the oil. I'm British, I can't really say that, but you get what I mean. Or the elites will exploit it, the internal elites. And so that lack of resources is perhaps, one of South Korea's benefits. It benefited from not having, so it had people as the natural resource. And the economic development, like during the 60s and 70s, they call it the miracle on the Han. A lot of it was just the number of inputs. They just got so many people working. A lot of it was women that previously didn't work. So they increased the inputs, that the outputs increased. But now the demographics is lowest. You said it's one of the highest suicide rates in the world. It's absolutely correct. It's the number one cause of death for young people, which is tragic, and then also one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And so you can't keep increasing the inputs to get more money in South Korea. So it's how you work. It's how you work now, isn't it? It's that old idea of do more is not going to cut it. I think most people, you see it, I see it, are the people that make the Sunung tests and everything like that going to see it is the question. Just one last thing maybe on education. How many hagwons do you go to? Do you go to any? Do you have to go through that, or?
I mean, I do go to academies. I think, I mean, again, I think it's sort of a pro and con situation with hagwons as well. And I think it also depends on which hagwon you go to. I think, like, especially for students who go to Hagwons, they're really going to relate to um, the idea that different Hagwons have very different styles of teaching.
Yeah.
I think that's something that is sometimes misunderstood by some people. Is academies in Korea are essentially, to a certain extent, replicas of school, like miniature schools. And so, just as different schools have, different teachers who have different styles of teaching, academies have different teachers who have different styles of teaching. They teach different subjects areas. And so I think, for example, in my case, I've gone to a couple of different Hagwons. There were Hagwons that, I personally benefited from going to, especially in terms of academics. There were other Hagwons that, weren't as helpful. So I think it's really just trying to balance out, because something that, like, for example, I know a lot of people who are strong advocates of academies and of Hagwons, something they really like to say, and something I agree to a certain extent, is the benefit and the reason you go to academies isn't necessarily to learn more. It's to learn what you're going to be learning at school, but in less time and putting in less effort, so more effectively learning what you're going to be learning. And that is one of the advantages, is if you go to an academy, ultimately you're learning what you're going to be learning at school.
Then you can sleep in school.
Exactly. Not that I do it.
I did say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, don't sleep at school first, but I think it definitely helps for you to understand what you're learning at school more effectively as well. So that you're not being hit with it all of a sudden for the first time. And I think that's sometimes one of the downsides of certain aspects of different educational curriculums, is sometimes they'll kind of throw things at students and expect them to know it or expect them to understand it right away. And that's not always the case. And academies, to a certain extent, help you to prepare for that. So I think if you know how to use it, it can be a real benefit to your academic success. But again, like I said, it has very clear disadvantages of, it's more work. You have homework for academies. So it's, triple the amount of homework you would normally get from, like, just if you were only going to school. So it's a lot more work and a lot more time.
I completely get you, Sihun, that private institution and further education and these things are great and they're very useful, especially if you get good teachers. For me, it's always been the amount, and in the schedule. So that's why I kind of asked you how many Hagwons, because one of the conversations I have with my wife about our two kids who are 7 and 6 is, what is appropriate amount of Hagwons per day after school and how many days per week? And my answer and her answer as a Korean mother are very, very different, right? As you can probably imagine, the Korean mother's like, right, once they finish school, then this Hagwon, and then this one, and then this one, and then come home, and then gumon, and then homework. And I'm like, that's the reality that I was just trying to get. The education is great. I think it's just the length and the time. You mentioned that every Hagwon is different. So there's the term sabasa, right? And person by person. And in the military, people were telling me now they have the term bubabu, bude by bude. So hak ba hak. Every Hagwon is different. Hak ba hak, that works. Yeah. Let me ask you about social media, Sihun, because when I grew up, when I was your age, we didn't have social media. There was none of that. I think Tamagotchis had just come and gone. That was the closest we had. A few of us had like Nokia phones with worm. You could play a worm game. You could only save 10 messages on your phone. So you you kept 9 that you really liked, and you just kept deleting the latest one. And if you got one from a girl, you kept that and then delete. So you could only keep 10, right? Or you got it from a boy, it doesn't matter. we didn't grow up with social media, and I think social media plays a big role on psychology, on image, on identity, and on politics, which is why you brought it up in the first place.
Yes.
My nephew Donghyun, I hope his mum and dad don't hear this, but he's uploading like 4 or 5 Insta stories per day with his soundtracks of Post Malone and Homies and things like this. How does social media play a role in Gen Z or your life or the people around you?
Yeah, I think social media is, I mean, there's obviously the basics. I would say that, everyone already knows is, it helps you connect with more people. It's a much easier and quicker method of
Mm,
communication. I don't know if I don't know if I would call it the most effective method of communication. There's definitely certain aspects of social media that sort of downplay or that exclude what you would normally get from like face-to-face conversations or through proper, quote unquote, proper like letters or emails. It's a little bit harder to do that or replicate that to the same extent through social media.
mm,
But they have different advantages. They have other um, advantages that social media has that those other methods of communication don't. And I think it's sort of trying to find the balance between that. Another thing is with regards to social media, I think it's especially for a lot of Korean people, I think it's a way of expressing yourself that you won't something that you really don't have the opportunity to do outside of social media for a lot of people.
mm,
For example, if we're looking at students at going to school, they have to wear uniforms. They're studying basically the entire day.
mm,
They finish school and like you were saying, they go to hagwons, then they go to another hagwon, then they go to another hagwon. So really, there's not a lot of opportunities for students to kind of engage in activities or you know interact with things that they personally enjoy or that they personally find interesting.
mm.
I don't want to say that that's the case for everyone. I'm sure there's a lot of students out there, a lot of Korean students who are following their passion. I have a lot of friends who are really interested in music. So I know some of them try to make their own music. They have their own albums. I think that's great. Um, but the reality is, for most students, that's difficult to do,
Mm,
especially if they're not pursuing those interests as career paths. Because then suddenly especially as you get older, you're faced with the reality that there's a limited amount of time. There's a certain amount of work that you need to put in, uh, which is probably going to end up taking most of that time that you have. Um, and do you want to spend the remaining time that you have following your passion, or maybe like getting an extra hour of sleep? I think most students, they end up choosing sleep or just a little bit more rest. And so social media, because it's quick, I think that's really the main advantage of social media is you can
mm,
basically create a story, Instagram story, for example, in like 5 seconds. Or you can send a message through Snapchat to your friend in just a few seconds. That's really the main advantage, is that you get to do all of those things without having to use up a lot of your time.
mm.
And because time is so important, especially for Korean people and Korean students, not just Korean students, but also just Korean people in general, it's something that people end up using a lot as a quicker way of communication. For example, at our school right now, Chatter International, basically every single student uses Kakao Talk, which is a very popular messaging platform here in Korea, and something that a lot of foreign students and a lot of teachers, when they first come to Korea, when they first come to our school, something that they often wonder or they don't really understand is, we have email, or we have like these other, even like
Mm.
just normal phones, they already have a messaging app built into the phone. Why don't
Mm.
you use that? Why do you use this other app that you have to go and download? And the answer is because it's in
Emoticons.
terms of, Yeah, emoticons. That's a very big factor.
Yeah.
But also with regards to KakaoTalk, you know, they have a lot of different functions that you can connect through KakaoTalk. Like
Mm.
there's Kakao Taxi, Kakao Bus, you there's Kakao Pay. You can send gifts to your friends through KakaoTalk.
Mm.
It's basically like this jack of all trades app that people can use, and saves a lot of time for people, where they don't have to go and find different apps for all of those different activities. They don't have to wait and like stand for 10 minutes until a taxi happens to pass by. They can call a taxi, and it just makes life a lot more convenient. So I think that's an ultimate, and especially for is even for those like foreign students and teachers, after like 2 months, you can see them using KakaoTalk as well. And
Mm.
it's just people find it a lot more convenient. And it saves, as I keep on repeating, it saves a lot of time, and it's just a much more efficient way of doing things, and a much more convenient way of doing things for a lot of people.
My mum said to me once that she was at Heathrow Airport in London waiting to come to Korea. And while she was waiting to board the plane, because there were lots of Korean people there, I think she was flying Korean Air at the time. While she was waiting, she kept hearing katok, katok, katok. And she was really excited because she associated that sound with Korea. She was like,
Yeah.
yes, this is the sound of Korea. And, you know, I don't actually consider Kakao Talk social media. To me, it's just something for sending messages. Like social media, I think is Instagram or
Yes.
YouTube to a certain extent, or Facebook or Twitter or these kind of things where you're scrolling, right? And you're
Yes.
doing this. It's interesting you mentioned Snapchat. You're the second young person that's mentioned Snapchat. Is Snapchat becoming a thing? Like, is that something used? I thought it was nobody used Snapchat, but is it a thing here?
I'm I wouldn't say it's becoming a thing. I think it's I definitely agree with you that, especially compared to some of the other social media, I think Instagram is definitely
Yeah,
the main thing.
right.
Like number one, there's no question about it. Facebook and Twitter, I honestly don't.
Mm.
I know one friend who uses Twitter, nobody else with Facebook and Twitter. Um, but I do know some people use Snapchat. I don't think it's a main thing that people use. I do think it is starting to die out a little bit.
Okay, okay.
Something I personally thought was really interesting was a lot of young students at our school, uh, like in middle school, for example, a lot of them use Discord, um, which is another, I guess, again, it wouldn't really count as a social media platform. It is a messaging, primarily messaging platform.
Mm.
But it is something that a lot of people use, oftentimes even over Kakao Talk. So I personally found that really interesting. Um, so maybe that's the next thing that people use, but at least for now, I think it's definitely Instagram that's king.
Are you? You might get in trouble talking about. Are you allowed to use Instagram? Do your parents let you on social media and things
Yeah.
like that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I am. No,
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure. Like some Korean parents are different, and it always works like that.
yes.
Give us some insight into Discord very briefly, Sehun, because Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, and it might just be
Mm.
a similar app, but you know, just take us through like Discord, how it works, or what's going on, why it's different. Just a little bit of insight, if you can, into that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not the best person to talk about Discord.
You're all we've got.
Um, yeah, but I think really it's personally, I think the usage of Discord amongst like the younger students at our school is pretty unique to our school, I think.
Mm.
So it's not really a phenomena that you're going to notice across like Korea. But I do think it does have some connection with differences in, again, we're kind of going back to like generational differences slightly, but
Mm.
differences in the environment that people in my age group grew up in versus the environment that people in like the current seventh grade, for example, grew up in. And I think one of the main differences there is, I would say two main differences actually. Number one is gaming. gaming was obviously a very big part of our environment as well as we were growing up, but definitely it's become a much more important factor. And it's just every year it becomes even bigger, especially here in Korea. New games are introduced, and people go crazy about new games, and it's becoming much more of a thing. And connected to that gaming sort of industry and gaming hype is also, I think, streaming is something that, like growing up, I don't think streaming was something that we really knew about or that we even cared about. You watch YouTube videos that were pre-recorded. You weren't watching, like, I'm honestly not even sure if Twitch and kind of those kind of streaming services even existed back then. So, but then obviously nowadays people are, that's probably one of the largest mediums of media that people consume.
Yeah.
Especially, and that obviously also includes young students. And so I think that's Discord in this case was one of those apps that was sort of popularized through those two mediums, because the way that I understand it is Discord was used a lot by people who stream games. So I think that's really kind of where it kind of started out, as a way for people to communicate with other people who also play like the same games, or who have that similarity, and then it eventually spread to become a much more sort of multi-purpose messaging platform. So yeah, I think that's kind of the origin. And the reason I said that I think it's a little bit more unique to our school versus just Korean public schools in general is that I think KakaoTalk is still much more prevalent for most Korean students. Again, that sort of ties in with what I was talking about earlier, that Korean people do have at least some bias for Korean companies and for Korean products. KakaoTalk is obviously a Korean product. It's by a Korean company. Discord isn't. So I think to a certain extent, there is that level of bias. And a part of that bias is also from the fact that because they're Korean companies, they know what Korean people want. Foreign companies, they might try and branch out to Korea, but unless they're making that conscious effort, it's sort of just going to be a global product that anyone can use equally. And it's not going to be targeted specifically to Korea and provide services that are convenient for Korean people like KakaoTalk can. So I think because our school is an international school, we are exposed to more of that international culture, and there's a little bit less bias in terms of the way that we choose different products that we decide to consume. But I mean, I do think that Discord is a pretty big platform, and although it may not be the platform that ends up being the main messaging platform that people use, it could be, for example, the inspiration for the next platform that actually does become that.
Sure. And there's protectionism in that conversation as well. I think Korean companies will kick out foreign inputs, whether it's like Airbnb or what was it, Uber, and they'll say, no, you can't do that. And then a month later, they'll make Kakao Taxi. And you're like, okay, that definitely is part of the conversation. Kakao is everywhere. Just one shout out to my friend Chan, who does the artwork for this. She's a young woman, Korean woman in her 20s. And on Kakao, she uses the same paid emoticons as this American 50-year-old friend I've got, and it's really weird. It's like there's generation across emoticons, but like, how can you two use the same things? You shouldn't do that. You mentioned games, so I just want to ask about this. Like I mentioned playing Snake on my phone and things like that. That was all we had. Now I guess it's Elden Ring and these big games. And what are the games are like? Just to give you some context, I've been at Seoul Women's University for about 15 years. And about 15 years ago, none of the students talked about games. Now, at the start of semesters, when students do like 자기소개 or self-introductions, so many of them are like, oh, I play Overwatch and I'm a cleric. And it's, what's that? Sorry, I'm trying to catch up. But it seems to be becoming more prevalent, and I noticed this even in among young women. So I guess I'm trying to ask you, Sihun, what games are being played, and what is the gaming culture here?
Yeah, I think the gaming culture here in Korea, it's really I mean, I say here in Korea, but I don't really know the gaming culture in other countries. So I don't know if it's that different or if there are any similarities. But definitely here in Korea, I think there is gaming trends and sort of, I guess, like one-hit wonders in a
Hmm.
sense of like gaming or games that are really popular for a couple of months. Then we kind of move on to the next popular game and then to another popular game. But there's also certain instances where we have games that, you know, were used to be really popular, kind of died out, and then they become popular again. And so I think it's in some ways it's quite arbitrary.
Can I
What
just
games?
ask, Sihun,
Yeah.
sorry, like when I mentioned, I don't know, games, but when you talk about games, are you talking about like games on the phones? Because I see a lot of students just like watching games. Are you talking about like PlayStation stuff or PC games, or are you talking about like these kind of smartphone handheld games?
I think I don't know if sort of those controller like PlayStation style games are as popular here in Korea.
Right.
I think it's really mostly PC and mobile games
Mm.
that are being played, especially PC. I mean, you know, the PC fan culture is very, it's a very big part of Korean culture. So I think yeah, so I when I'm talking about games, it's mostly with regards to PC games, but I think especially mobile games, I think are played. I don't want to say played more, but they're played more frequently.
Mm.
Because PC games, you those are sort of like the large games that you have to take out time to play, and like you have to go to either like unless you own a PC, you have to go to a PC bang, you have to take out like a couple, maybe like an hour or two to
Mm.
play a game. Mobile games, you can really just kind of take your phone out, like on your way to school. Maybe you just play like a quick 5 minute game or something like that. So I think the number of times that people play mobile games, it's just a lot more frequent than PC games, even though I would say PC games tend to be more popular amongst Koreans. So for example, I think one like if you talk about Korea and if you talk about gaming, I think one of the first games that most people will talk about is StarCraft. Is probably the game I would say that started the gaming culture here in Korea,
Yeah.
or at least one of the games that really kind of launched esports here in Korea and the gaming culture. So, and that's obviously a PC game. But if you look at a lot of like young Korean students right now, for example, not a lot of them play StarCraft. It's really more about like for example, a popular game that a lot of my friends play is League of Legends. I think that's a pretty popular game. Um, there's also certain international trends that I think the Korean gaming culture is affected by. Recently, a very uh, I guess not even recently anymore, but a couple of months ago, I think maybe like last year or 2 years ago, a really popular game, I think around the world was Among Us. And that was really
Mm.
popular here in Korea as well, with a lot of Korean, especially Korean students who played those games. There's um, just like a lot of the Clash Royale, Clash of Clans, those games were really popular in Korea as well. And they're actually kind of starting to pick up again, at least like at my school. So I think it's really just a question of um, people playing games. And I think just a general pattern, if I had to recognize one of, if we look at all of the games that are really popular, they tend to be games that are very competitive and that sort of are multiplayer games. I think tend to be a lot more popular here in Korea. Games that
Mm.
you can play with your friends, where you can check your ranking. I think that's sort of part of that Korean culture as well, where you know we have that very competitive mindset. And games are a sort of way to, I guess, engage in that mindset without having very major consequences of like, just because you're a relatively lower ranking in a particular game doesn't mean you're going to have a bad ranking at school or something like that. I think it's just I think it's sort of almost a subconscious thing where Koreans, they prefer games where you compete with your friends, and it's a social activity more so than the actual competitive nature of it.
Because in Korean schools, and maybe some people don't know this, but in Korean schools, most students know their ranking in the class, don't they? They know out of 30 students or 356 students what rank they are, and that's a weird thing. And so the gaming culture just reflects that. And I can absolutely see, although you said it wasn't the case, Sihoon, that as somebody's ranking in the school academic calendar goes down, their ranking on the computer game goes up. They're like, well, I might suck at school, but I'm going to beat you on the computer game. And so it's like it's equalizing the playing field, isn't it? It's like I get my success that way. Just we'll turn back to politics in a minute, but thank you for that idea that Korean gaming is mobile gaming. By the way, if my camera goes blurry, it's totally cool. I think it's to get the sound quality, which is you still sound great, so don't worry about that, dude.
Thank you.
Just before we go back to politics and bring this round, I need to ask you about music. If we've talked about social media, we've talked about gaming.
Yes.
Like, if I believe the press, you and your high school friends are all like going around dancing to Butter and next Level, and that kind of thing, and Stray Kids. Is that the case?
Short answer is no.
My nephew's not even, like I said, he's Post Malone and homies. So what is the case then?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, that is definitely how I think especially young Korean people are portrayed in not just Korean media, but in international media. It's all about K-pop. It's all about, even within K-pop, like those top, like 2 or 3 groups, BTS, Blackpink, etc. And I think those obviously they are very popular in Korea, and I think that's reflected in just like statistically speaking, they are really popular. I would say there's probably not a single Korean student at least who hasn't heard a BTS song or a Blackpink song at some point in their life. So it is popular, it is commonplace. But if we're talking about what students listen to and enjoy listening to, K-pop is a part of the music that people listen to, but it's also, what you were talking about earlier, Post Malone, those sort of Western hip-hop music or rap music. We listen to pop music. I remember a couple of years ago, back when I was in elementary school, Maroon 5 was really popular for a lot of students. And I think that was just globally speaking, they were really popular. Coldplay was really popular. Just like the top bands. And I think that's still the case for music. And even within K-pop, I think it's just BTS and those kind of top names get thrown around a lot, especially by foreign media and by like people outside of Korea. But if you actually come to Korea, I think you'll see that even within K-pop, there's a lot of diversity, and there's a lot of diversity within Korean music in general. Like there's Korean ballad music, which is also really popular amongst a lot of Korean people and a lot of Korean students. Recently, trot music was really popular here in Korea as well. I don't know where that came from, but it was really popular.
Japan it came from. Sorry, I should have said. Right, it's Enka. Yeah, anyway, sorry, continue. Yeah.
And then, I mean, like Korean rap music as well. Show Me the Money is a really popular program here in Korea.
Yeah.
But, a lot of those things don't get talked about in the media and in like, especially foreign media. So I think it's really Korean, the types of music that Korean people listen to is about as diverse as, people from any other country. I think it's, just because, for example, you're living in America doesn't mean you only listen to rap music or you only listen to like patriotic anthems. I think it's, you listen to a diverse range of music. American people listen to K-pop, so I think it makes sense that Korean people listen to pop music from other countries as well,
Mm,
and music from other countries. So I think K-pop definitely a very big part of Korean culture and of Korean music culture. But to say that, that's the only thing Korean students listen to, or even the most popular thing Korean students listen to, I think it's all about, again, that sort of trend. Sometimes Korean pop, yeah, like there are times when a BTS song is the most popular music that Korean students listen to.
mm.
But then, maybe a few weeks later, it might be a new song by some other K-pop group, or by a Korean ballad singer, or by a, rap musician in France. You never know.
Hmm. No, you do never know, and sometimes we don't get that media representation, and that's why I ask you or try to listen to what people are talking about. That was a pretty good look at, I think, some of Gen Z lifestyles. Shall we turn back to politics? Because there's a few things that we didn't
Yes.
catch. So the conversation will turn, but as we come towards this latter stage, some of these questions here, Sihun, they're right on the money. We're going to talk about 여성가족부.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the Ministry of Gender and Equality in English, but in Korean, 여성가족부, which is like the woman family ministry. The names are
Yes.
different, which I think is important to sort of recognize. A huge talking point about the last election was whether this should be closed or not closed.
Yes.
I know a lot of people are opposed to it. I also know some people that are in favor of it closing down, even women who
Yes.
believe that it should be. So there's no unanimous perspective on this, but it was a huge talking point. I think it still is.
Yeah.
Do the names matter? Should it be closed down? Why was this a big sort of torch around which a lot of conversation was centered? How do we understand this conversation around the 여성가족부, Sihun?
Yeah. So I think just starting off with the name first of all, like you said, the name in Korean and the name in English is, it's a small difference. At the same time, it's a very big difference.
Mm,
And I think that's also something that gets brought up sometimes in Korea as well, is, maybe it is important to kind of change the name of the ministry, so that it better reflects the mission that the ministry has, and that the message that the ministry is sending out to people when
mm,
they see the name is, if you read 여성가족부, which, as you said, basically it directly translates to the Ministry of Family and of Women.
mm,
Um, as for example, as a Korean male, if you're looking at that name, a lot of people might say, does that mean we're excluded from that, from gender equality? Obviously, I would say that, just objectively speaking, most cases of gender discrimination do tend to target women much more than men. Um,
yeah.
but that isn't to say that men aren't victims of gender discrimination sometimes as well, or sexual harassment, or those kind of issues related to gender. Um, and so I think that's a very common criticism that was made in terms of the name of the ministry, that it should, I mean, we're calling it the Ministry of Gender Equality in English. Why don't we do the same in Korean? And I think to understand the sort of debate surrounding the ministry, it's really important to kind of understand the context, because, for example, as someone who has absolutely no background information about Korea or about the ministry, and you just hear, like Korean men trying to abolish, like the Ministry of Gender Equality, that sounds really bad. That sounds like,
Yeah,
are you insane?
yeah, I agree.
And I think, so that's why you do need to understand that it's not so black and white. And I think the problem with the Ministry of Gender Equality, I think there were two main criticisms towards the ministry. Number one is that they don't actually promote gender equality. I think that's a very common criticism that comes especially from the conservative side, is that the Ministry of Gender Equality, they don't actually promote gender equality. They actually divide people much more than they unite the two genders. The second criticism, and I think it's really interesting because this criticism actually comes much more from the relatively more progressive side of Korean politics, is the Ministry of Gender Equality actually doesn't do enough to promote gender equality. And that's also a common criticism. And so to kind of understand, and I think that's really where the difference between the two genders also start to come in, because first criticism is, generally speaking, much more often made by males, Korean men, and the second criticism is much more often made by Korean females. And from my personal point of view, I think it's sort of a mixture of both, where like the Ministry of Gender Equality is essentially, and I think this is something that they try to promote as well, is it's not just about gender equality, it's also about family. And that's something that they really try and emphasize, especially whenever some of these criticism or these critiques come up, is, you know, yeah, we are the Ministry of Gender Equality, but we also have this other really large factor, family, which is really another very important social issue here in Korea. As you brought up a few minutes ago, the birth rate here in Korea is getting lower every year. So that's also one of the main things that the Ministry of Gender Equality is technically, that's under their sort of jurisdiction to try and address. So we have this thing that we need to address as well. You know, we can't really be only focused on gender equality. So I think it's really important that we kind of look at some of the things that the Ministry of Gender Equality has done, because obviously, though, like just beyond claims, that's objectively speaking, that's what they've done, that's what they did, that's their accomplishments. So based on that, we can kind of look at, you know, some of those arguments and whether they're valid. So I think the really main issue that a lot of Korean men had with the Ministry of Gender Equality, and one of the reasons why this entire argument that the Ministry of Gender Equality should be abolished or shut down came up in the first place, was because a lot of people, a lot of Korean men especially, thought that the Ministry of Gender Equality was giving unfair advantages to women in the workplace or in other areas of life. And I think it's, I remember even before gender issues became a very major sort of talking point, even when I was like in village school or in elementary school, something that a lot of people kind of argued about or debated about is the Korean military service, which I think that's like 50% of the gender issue debate is Korean men, you know, have to serve in the military, Korean women don't. And so a lot of Korean men, you know, I think Korean men are quite split on that issue as well, in that obviously I don't think anyone disagrees that the military is a very important part of Korea and of South Korea, especially because we have North Korea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, although the number of years that you have to serve in the military has been going down over the last several years, it's still a significant portion of, you know, a person's life, especially because it is at that time when, you know, we like to say it's the prime of someone's life in their 20s, in their early 30s, where, you know, that's when they're either going to university or they've just graduated from university, they're trying to find work. And then all of a sudden you get taken to the military, you know, which like in some ways it sounds almost like a dystopian, you know, like novel. So I think, and because it only applies to Korean men, I think that's really where a lot of Korean men feel that they're being treated unfairly. But one of the things that sort of, I guess, justified that to a certain extent was the fact that number one, the conditions of like actually serving in the military and the number of years, it's getting better somewhat.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit, I guess, more bearable. And number two, there was something called the 군 가산점, which basically, I guess, the easiest way to think about it would be like a certain, like a point system, where if you've served in the military, and this doesn't necessarily, only apply to Korean men, because there are also Korean women who serve in the military, so it
Right.
would also apply to them as well. Just anyone who served in the military, they have these additional points that when they are applying for certain jobs, that they basically get to use those points, and they have a higher chance of being accepted and actually getting that job. Um, and obviously, because most of the people who kind of benefit from that point system, or at least in this particular case, were Korean men, because Korean men all serve in the military. Uh, that was something that the Ministry of Gender Equality, and also a lot of uh, women's organization people and advocates, and sort of what people, I guess, I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word feminism, just because in Korea, there's a very negative connotation with that word.
Hmm.
Um, but, and I don't want to say that people who kind of supported this are all, you know, evil. I think, there's definitely an argument to be made that that's not fair. And, it is also fact that the courts basically said it was unconstitutional to have that point system. But essentially they abolished that point system. And that was also one of the things that a lot of Korean men, were saying, we have to spend 1 to 2 years in the military, uh, getting paid something, I think, close to the minimum wage, possibly even less. Um, and, meanwhile, female counterparts are getting that head start. And then when we have to return to the workplace, we don't get any benefits, or we don't get any recognition for that service either. So I think that's really where a lot of Korean men felt that they were being discriminated against. And, you see a lot of, I guess, almost gaffes that the Ministry of Gender Equality kind of made throughout the last couple of years. Something that was really controversial was they actually released this sort of board game that they tried to incorporate into the educational curriculum, which was basically something like Monopoly, but you have a card that basically designates you as either male or female. And if you're female, no matter where you land, you have to go back to like the first stop. And that's teaching like that's teaching students about the discrimination that women face in real life. And so very obviously that was very controversial, and it received a lot of criticism. And that's also going back to the other side of the argument that the ministry isn't doing enough to promote gender equality, because like in reality, implementing that board game in the educational curriculum, what difference is that actually going to make in helping to address people who are actually suffering from gender discrimination, who are actual victims? And this also goes back to some of the more high profile cases that of like sexual assault, with regards to like the former Seoul mayor, for example. There were allegations of that he sexually harassed his coworkers, and I think it was his secretary. But then the Ministry of Gender Equality, or the Minister of Gender Equality, basically kind of hesitated to criticize and to kind of investigate that case. And there was a lot of criticism for that action, because essentially what people were seeing was, the only reason you're hesitant to kind of take action is because he's the same political party. So you're basically taking sides,
Yeah.
which as the Minister of Gender Equality, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. And I think so that's really where a lot of the criticism comes from. And I mean, there's a lot of different examples and a lot of different cases that we could look at, obviously. But ultimately, I think that those sort of ways that the Ministry of Gender Equality has shown that it's not really up to the task of performing its mission. I don't think anyone's calling for the abolishment of the ministry because they disagree that we should have gender equality, because they disagree that we should address discrimination. If anything, actually, a lot of young Korean men especially agree that there's discrimination, and that there was discrimination for a lot of the people in the older generation, a lot of women, that they face that discrimination, that we need to address that. But it's just a question of how do we address that in a way that's both considered sufficient enough by women, and also considered not discriminatory towards men by Korean men. And the Ministry of Gender Equality, unfortunately, I think has sort of disappointed both sides in their attempt to try and balance that out, which raises the question, so does that mean we should abolish them? Or another popular opinion is, can we try and reform them somehow so that we still keep the ministry, but they actually perform the mission and the responsibilities that we expect them to do? And I think that's really where a lot of the debate comes in. And at that point, I think it's really a question of your personal belief. It's not so much a question of whether you agree with, like I said, it's not a question of whether you agree with the fact that we need to address gender discrimination or that we need to address the gender issue. I think almost everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
It's just, can we do it with the system that we have right now and just make a couple of adjustments? Or is it something that requires an entirely new sort of approach, an entirely new branch of government to try and address? And I think that's something that, personally, I think it's something that we need to have more discussions about as a country before we make any sort of decision. Not only because we are so divided on that issue, but because, even without the issue of the Ministry of Gender Equality, because we're transitioning into the new administration, there's likely going to be a lot of other changes to the government structure that's going to be taking place. And the Ministry of Gender Equality, I think if we were to abolish it right now, that's going to cause, additional chaos and confusion in a situation that's already very confusing and very chaotic. So I think it's something we need to discuss and reach a consensus on first, by evaluating, the advantages and disadvantages of either argument, and then make a decision that's informed and that people can agree was the correct decision, or at the very least take responsibility for, if it doesn't turn out successful.
I think you've rather brilliantly laid out some of the issues and problems related to this, whether it's in terms of the demographics, various gaffes made by the ministry, the situation regarding military service and the abolishment of that point system, the fact that Korean men spend sort of almost 2 years of their life in this, when they're taken out generally of university, they'll do it after a couple of years there. And it's a really complex and deep and politicized topic. And yet most of what we hear about it online is Korean men want to abolish gender equality. Yeah. I think that framing of it is the problem. And you're absolutely, yes, from my personal perspective, Sihun, you're absolutely right in that there needs to be discussion, there needs to be long form things. And I think that the social media detracts from that, or it presents it in such a exaggerated way that it prevents people from actually engaging in the realities, because the realities are complex and long form, and
very
it is, and it's tied into a lot of different issues. And this is a government ministry, And you can look at any government ministry and they will be making gaffes all over the place.
Yeah.
Their policies will be failing. Look at the people in charge of housing prices.
Yeah.
They're not doing a good job. Look at the Ministry of Unification. They're getting their
Yeah.
buildings blown up by North Korea, right? I guess the point that I'm trying to say is it's not unique to a government ministry to be failing in their policies. It's actually generally par for the course, because
Yeah.
they mean well, and I'm sure they're trying to do their best, but they're bureaucrats and they're officials. And one of the things that we've probably learned is that those people are often unable to control the world around them. If anything, they're
Yes.
generally being reactive to events, and sometimes reacting to make the situation worse than actually controlling or being proactive.
Yes.
So, yeah, I do agree with you that I think if it were to be abolished, like as soon as they come in, and President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol seems to be keeping to a lot of his pledges thus far.
Yes.
One of the things, whether you like him or don't like him, all the things that he said in the lead up, he's actually going through with, and that seems to be part of his character. I think if and this particular one, if they just close it down, that invites, it's not the right way to solve that problem, but yeah. But there is gender inequality here, and there are problems, but I think the young people, they should be on the same page how to solve these problems, like you're talking about. Can I ask you about Tongwade?
Yes.
I'm sort of jumping on this, but the gender equality. I'm going to speak to I don't know if she's a schoolmate, a classmate of yours, Kay, in the future, a young woman. So I'm also going to try to get young women's views on this, and put them together and see how it plays out. I want to ask you about Tongwade, which for any listeners is the Korean president's residence. It's called the Blue House in English. And President Moon in 2017, when he went in there, he said that he was going to move out and he was going to become the Kwangmun president and do this. He didn't eventually. He stayed there, and there were various reasons for that. President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol has said he's not going to go into it. There's been talk that it's a shamanistic, it's made by shamans, it's made by his wife. He wants to be in the Ministry of Defense so he can implement some Orwellian totalitarian government, and there's lots of conversation about that. But it seems both political parties wanted to move out there. So, but what I want to ask you about, Si-hoon, is that it's kind of weird for me to imagine a political leader coming in and saying, I'm not going into number 10 Downing Street.
Yeah.
Fuck that place. Or like the white. It's weird to me. And President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, he said he's going to open it up to the public. I saw that there's already been like 1 million people sign up to go on tours of the residence when it opens. How do you understand this as a Korean? Like, is it losing some of your history? Is it nice to open up to the people? Does the Tongwade symbolize anything to you?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it is weird to have any politician, but especially like the head of the government, newly elected, to say, I'm not going to be staying in the same place all of my predecessors stayed in. That symbolizes my position, and I think there's definitely going to be, and I mean, the whole reason there's a debate is obviously because there are diverging opinions on President-elect Yoon moving out. Personally, I think, again, there is definitely going to be something that's lost in that process. I think the Blue House is obviously very symbolic of Korea and Korea's government and Korean politics, and to say that I'm going to be moving over to what is essentially just like another building in Korea, that does mean that we're losing some of that symbolic meaning. And I think it would be the same thing, for example, if we think about if Biden one day said, I'm moving out of the White House, and moving into some other building in Washington D.C. or in New York, I think that would come as very shocking. And although the history of the Blue House isn't as long as the White House or as some of the other kind of presidential residences, it is still a presidential residence. It was the house. It was the residence of several presidents, like several Korean presidents. So I think there is still meaning to the location. I think that's also one of the reasons why they're essentially saying that they're going to be returning it back to the people. So it's not just, we're moving, so we're going to be replacing the building with a new building. We're preserving it as sort of a place that holds those memories of what it used to symbolize. And I think it's sort of, I think it's going to depend on how President-elect Yoon defines his new Blue House, which I think he's actually he's calling the People's House for now, before they come up with an official name. I think that's what I read in the news. But it's going to have I think, significant symbolism, because it's not just as the president of any country, you can't just move into the average gray skyscraper and say, this is my new home now. Because it's not just about what it represents domestically. It's about how that particular building or that particular place of residence reflects your country internationally, to other countries and to other the leaders of other countries. And so I think it's really important that whatever way the president-elect decides to go with his new Blue House, it needs to be something just as, if not even more, symbolic than the Blue House was to Korea and to Korean presidents, so that we don't lose that the historical significance that the Blue House held, that gives it a certain amount and level of legitimacy. I think that's really important as well. Is you can be elected president, but there is like in different countries, there are certain locations that were their historical significance comes from the fact that they were the place that, for example, every time the new king ascended to the throne, that was where they were crowned, for example. Or every time a new president was elected, this is the place that they were sworn in. There is, that precedent, that history, and that continuity that I think is one of the things that Korea, as a relatively young, in terms of democracy, a relatively young nation, lacks, is that tradition and continuity that we need to have for our government. And that's also reflected, I think, in our political parties. Like, for example, a few minutes earlier in this interview, we joked about how the Conservative Party changes their name like every couple of years,
and their colors.
And their colors.
Remember when they were pink?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just really confusing. But I think that it all comes into play in the fact that we don't really have an established tradition yet for our democracy and for our government. And we're still experimenting with different things, but at the same time, at some point we're going to have to settle on something that we can all agree on and that we can kind of keep as, this is what you can expect from Korean democracy. This is, the symbol of Korean democracy. And I think the sooner we can kind of arrive on something that we can all agree on, the better it will be for not just the continuity of our democracy, but also, like I said, the way that other countries view Korea. If you look at the White House, immediately you think of the American government, you think of the American president. You don't even need to see the White House. You just hear the White House and you think American government. I think the Blue House, obviously was kind of getting to that point of being recognized as, okay, that's the place where Korean presidents live. And then now that we're transitioning out of it, we're going to be losing that recognition that we've been building. So it's going to be really important that we build up that sort of reputation and that recognition internationally.
President Biden is coming to South Korea in about 3 weeks, as far as I understand. So it's going to be really interesting. Like, where mate, go past the Gyeongbya Joshi and take the elevator up to the fourth floor. The president's up there in this kind of grey apartment. But I mean, it loses some of that grandiosity, that spectacle and that scene. But yeah, it'd be interesting what name it's given. It won't be historic or symbolic for at least a few decades, will it? Because it needs time to build up. So it's just a really fascinating development to see a president give away the presidential residence that has been there. And to give a bit of British perspective, I guess, I think we have the best of both worlds, because we have the spectacle of Buckingham Palace and all of this, right? All that pomp and ceremony for greeting heads of state, right? We can do all that. But then the Prime Minister is in like 10 Downing Street, which is this really small, cramped, residential. It's right there on the street. And I think there is an advantage to that. I'm not all of a sudden saying that our Prime Minister is this great man of the people. Not at all. But there is more of that. They're not as far removed from people. They're not a symbol of authority or power, but they're in a normal place and they face questions and they have to walk along the street. And there is that element to it, which I quite like, I think. Regardless of who does it. This doesn't mean suddenly I support this party or that, but one of the things that I've noticed about, I would like the Korean politicians to speak to the people and the media a bit more. Just what Prime Minister Johnson, every week he has to get grilled in front of people on television with people asking him all sorts, and you see him squirm and refute and lie, but it's right there. There's no getting away from it. That's democracy. I definitely agree with you. I think that's exactly what President Moon promised he would do when he got elected. That's what President-elect Yoon has promised to do as well. And actually the media has kind of picked up on that as well. Recently was, I think a couple of days ago, I was actually reading a news article about that, of how President-elect Yoon, he promised that he would be, the president who communicates with the people, who communicates with the media. He kind of did that when he was first elected. Nowadays, not so much. Or at least not as frequently. So, the media picks up on that, the people pick up on that. And I think it's really important, with a part of that is obviously the place of residence, but more importantly, I think is just the president's attitude towards communicating. Because you have for example, in America, you had presidents like Barack Obama or Ronald Reagan, who are considered, very good communicators. And they lived in the White House, which is definitely not, 10 Downing Street. They had to stop President Trump communicating. He was communicating too much. They were
exactly.
Shut up, get off Twitter. Sorry,
that's too much. And so I think, I think Korean presidents, not just Korean presidents, but Korean politicians in general, have a lot to kind of learn from that. In that regard of actually communicating with people, communicating with the media. And I think it's really important because Korean presidents, especially, during their term, they face a lot of criticism. And, another part of it is, and I think this is sort of an unfortunate precedent, that Korean presidents don't usually end up very well off after their terms.
That's an understatement.
It's the outcome isn't usually that great, and I think a part of that is because there's such a a distance between politics and between people,
Mm.
that, you know, people are just not satisfied with what's going on in politics. And I mean, to be completely honest, most politicians probably have something that, is something that they did was immoral or illegal, or something that, people can kind of pick up on and criticize. It's just really a question, I think, of will people actually pick up on that?
Mm.
And is it going to be a big deal? I think because there are politicians, for even like in Korean politics, who, they get caught for doing something, but it's like a minor violation of the law, or it's something that, people can to a certain extent understand, and sort of kind of let go. But with Korean presidents, especially, I think, even the smallest, it doesn't even have to be a violation of the law. I remember during the Seworo incident, one of the ministers had to resign because he there was a photograph of him eating instant ramen noodles
I
at the
remember that.
scene, and which is like, is that a crime? Is that really such a bad thing to do? Some people might ask, but considering the context of the situation and the position that the person was in, obviously enough people thought that that was something that wasn't right, that was condemnable, and that ultimately led to his resignation. And Korean presidents, the president is the highest position in the government, so there's the highest expectations. So if you can't meet those expectations, Korean people are very brutal
Mm.
about that. And I think by communicating more, you can somewhat, relieve that tension a little bit. You have a chance to justify and explain yourself. You have a chance to build consensus, build agreement between the people before you proceed with certain initiatives or projects. And that way, even if something goes wrong, even if something doesn't turn out the way that you wanted it to, at least you know that, the people supported you in that process, so you can take, responsibility together.
Mm.
But because that hasn't been happening, because presidents and political parties have essentially kind of just gone with whatever they wanted to do, and you see that with like the current situation with the prosecution service as well right now, like because the current ruling party, who won't be the ruling party for very long,
Mm.
are who have that super majority in the National Assembly, are trying to pass laws, um, basically without the consent or without consensus amongst politicians and without agreement amongst the people. Um, and I think that's really the main issue with Korean politics is people don't communicate, and people don't care to communicate.
Mm. Yeah, and Professor or Ambassador La Jong-il wrote a really interesting piece about Korean politics in which he said that, the two parties, they're not your enemy, they're your co-workers. And the more times that these two parties fight with each other, it's the actual people that suffer.
Yeah.
You're meant to be working together for the people, right? You have different
Yes.
ideas, but I think they've missed that incredibly. This story with reforming the prosecution and fast tracking it through with a majority
Yeah.
without any consensus it's really dangerous. I mean, but
Yeah.
it's so obvious and blatant, and just protecting people, and President Moon came in 2017, and there was the tangible, genuine hope in the country
Yes.
that it was going to be a Gwanghwamun president, a president of the people, a feminist president, a president for gender
Yes.
equality, president of peace and reconciliation with North
Mm.
Korea, and an end to collusion between government and big business. The
Yes.
Samsung chief gets put in jail. The
Yeah.
president gets put in jail. We're going to clean. I don't want to say drain the swamp. That would be wrong. But there was that genuine excitement that a revolution
Yes.
of the people had happened, and I think perhaps one of the lessons that maybe Korea should learn there, that was that, well, maybe it's not a correct lesson, but the expectations were too high. They just couldn't be met, and not one of those things really came
Yeah.
to fruition at all, which is a shame, but that's real life. You know, we always have a lot of plans and we try hard, but sometimes we don't succeed because they're difficult problems. I wonder if the new president expectations are really low. That might like everyone's like, this guy's not going to do a good job, and the expectations are really low. That might be in his favor in some way. That, you know, if the expectations are so high, we're probably further back than we were with North Korea. The Samsung chief's now back in his place, and so I wonder about expectations is a big thing. Do you have any thoughts on the next 5 years? Like, is there going to be any improvements? Are we going to backslide from democracy? Do you think that some of these challenges might be met and achieved, or will daily life continue for most people while the politicians keep fighting? What takes place during the next 5 years, Si-hoon, do you think?
Yeah, I think really it's going to be it's going to depend on two things. It's the first one is going to be the president's attitude towards political discourse, and which is it's a really big factor that we don't know yet because the new president-elect has no experience in politics. So we really have no idea which, what he's going to be like as a politician. I mean, what he's been doing recently, I think personally, I don't think bodes too well. And that's just because, again, going back to that example of the prosecution, reforming the prosecution service, people who were following the process will know that they actually did reach an agreement at some point. The two parties did reach an agreement, but then the conservative party of the new president-elect actually went back on that agreement and kind of turned it down, which is why we sort of returned to the fighting that we started off with. So I think just looking at that as well, as the president, it's really important that you are able to balance between representing the people, but also, governing, which I think, it's ideally those two things are identical and they align. But sometimes, especially when you're working with opposition, you do need to compromise at certain points with certain things. And I think this was one of those examples where the outcome would have been much better for both sides if there had been if the attitude of the politicians had been much more focused on finding an agreement and finding that compromise, rather than each trying to push forward with their personal agendas. So I talked about earlier the ruling party sort of kind of pushing forward with this initiative because they have the majority in the National Assembly, but it was just as much. I think the Conservative Party was just as much to blame for the agreement falling apart and the outcome that we have right now as the Democratic Party was. And obviously we don't really know the full details yet, but there were a lot of people who said that one of the main reasons why we kind of the Conservative Party turned back on that agreement that they had was because of President-elect Yoon and his sort of influence, which I think also it's a little bit concerning, because if you think about it, Korea is a presidential republic, so we have a separate executive and legislative branch, and they're separate for a reason. So the president, he's not even really the president yet. He's the president-elect. Having that much influence over what goes on in the National Assembly over, the legislative branch, I think is a little bit dangerous. If we're thinking about it in, democratic terms of, is there a separation of powers? And are there checks and balances? Because that was one of the problems, I think, with the Moon administration, was that basically the Democratic Party was the government. They were the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. That was a common criticism. You
Mm.
know, so if we have that again for 5 years, it's just that the parties changed to the Conservative Party. You know, what difference is there from the previous administration that the Conservative Party criticized so much if they're going to be doing the exact same things? And number two is the outcome of the next couple of elections. I think those will really determine how things go the next 5 years as well.
Mm.
I'm hoping that we'll have a much more balanced National Assembly, because, you know, if any, obviously a certain faction is going to have a majority just because of the way that numbers work. But having a super majority like the one that the Democratic Party had, like the last since the last elections, I think, you know, that's basically going back to my first point. That's going to really support the idea that a single political party can dominate an entire government, which I don't think works well, and it didn't work well this time. So it's going to basically kill discussion. It's going to kill debate, which I think we need right now, especially because we are so divided. And so I'm hoping that we'll have a much more balanced National Assembly. And the more balanced the National Assembly is, even I would go as far as to say that it might even be better if the Democratic Party retains to a certain extent their majority in the National Assembly, just so that we can guarantee that the National Assembly and the presidential office actually have to work together and discuss and find compromise, rather than kind of pushing forward with the political agenda of a single political party.
Mm. And just focusing on trying to put each other in jail and things like
Yes.
this, which, because again, it's the people that suffer, isn't it? So
Yes.
let's consider the people. And by the way, in this conversation 3 years ago, people said that Korean conservatism was dead forever, and there would be
Yes.
decades of Democratic Party rule. And
Yes.
Korean politics changes so quickly, man.
Very
You,
quickly.
you mentioned the names of the parties, the colors, but
Yes.
also the winners and losers. It's all over the place. You demonstrate a really good, solid understanding of it, and you convey it so clearly, because I guess one of the things that some young people say to me at universities is like, David, politics is hard. And it is sometimes.
It is.
It's really confusing. Let me ask you about the power of the people here, and representative, because that's what we associate with democracies, I think.
Yeah.
And somebody once, this week they're going to remove the mask mandate outside in South Korea. And what was interesting is there was an announcement about an announcement. Right, so they come out and they say, in 2 days we're going to announce that masks are going to be off, and so they were announcing an announcement, and some people were confused by that. And what I suggested, and I want to get your take, is that the government or politicians, the ruling party, whoever they might be, will sort of suggest we're probably going to do this, and they put it out there to the people and they test the waters. And if the public lose their shit, they're like, oh, we'll think about it. Like, hang on. But if it seems to be okay, then they'll go ahead with it. But it seems to, and even the president, or, you know, whoever they might be, the leaders go, we need to reflect public opinion. They don't say we need to uphold the law or we need to uphold values. There is always a constant attention to public opinion and making sure the public is right. The public hold a lot of power in South Korea, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, they do, and at the same time they don't. And it's somewhat, I guess, if you look at it with sort of lighthearted from a lighthearted point of view, it could come off as pretty comedic as well with political parties, because like you said, they talk a lot about public opinion, but they only talk about public opinion when it's in their favor. And the moment, you know, public opinion turns against them, it's, you know, oh, the polls are incorrect, or it's not actually accurate. It's not an accurate reflection of the public opinion, or, you know, we have to get this done no matter what. And I think I definitely agree with you, especially I think after the presidential election, something that a lot of people, kind of forget, and even politicians, is that the next elections are just like a month away now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like they're really close. So technically, like right after the presidential election was over, that's still, now we're just going back into the election cycle again. And that's the pattern with any political party, any politician during any election cycle, is they test the water, and they are very careful about what they say. Um, and I think that's the same thing with the mask mandate. Was the current Moon administration and President Moon and his presidential office, in the lead up to the presidential election as well, they were really careful about what they do and what they say. And I think you could tell through their actions, they were a lot more quiet than they used to be before. They weren't really announcing a lot of like new initiatives or new events or new projects. They were keeping things, stable and steady, so that there was nothing really to criticize, and at the same time, nothing really to praise. And yeah, so definitely, again, I think it's a similar situation where, the Democratic Party lost the presidential election. So really their number one priority now is winning the local elections. And that way, at the very least, they can somewhat retain their political power that they have in the government. And, it's also, a lot of it has to do with, I think in Korean politics, and I want to say also in some of the politics of other countries, there's really strong factionalism.
Yeah.
But especially in Korea, you're going to hear a lot about the kepa of different political parties, like pro Yoon politicians or pro Lee politicians, pro Moon. And I think a lot of that also comes into play when politicians and the government is sort of deciding what to say and when to say things. It's very calculated. And right now, the Democratic Party is very split, I would say, the Conservative Party is also very split, but the Democratic Party is split between their more pro-Lee politicians, Lee being the previous Democratic candidate, Lee Jae-myung, and then basically those politicians who are opposed to or who aren't necessarily pro-Lee. And I think it's really the thing with President Moon and the presidential office is they're in a really tough spot. They're in a really very tricky situation where basically nothing's gone the way that they would have wanted things to go. They lost the presidential election, so they're going to have to transition over. There's the prosecution reform is also a major issue, and obviously if the prosecution reform doesn't happen or doesn't pass, there's concerns that they're going to investigate the current president and his associates in the presidential office, and they're likely going to find something, which is that's what the prosecution service in Korea excels at, is finding dirt on Korean presidents.
Yeah.
And it's also within the political party itself. Obviously I'm a little bit careful to say, like, to assume things, but just based on my understanding personally and what I've seen on the news, President Moon and former presidential candidate Lee aren't necessarily on the same faction within their political party as well.
Yeah.
They actually ran against each other in the previous presidential election preliminaries. And in this case as well, I would say what the person that many people consider to be sort of President Moon's successor or potential successor, Lee Na-kyun, actually lost the preliminaries to Lee Jae-myung as well. And there was an active attempt by Lee Jae-myung during the presidential election to distance himself from President Moon and some of his failed policies.
Yep.
So there is a lot of tension within the party as well. So from the president's perspective, President Moon's perspective, right now is not the time to make any dangerous moves, even if it has nothing to do with politics and it's just a mask mandate.
Mm.
Public opinion is already bad enough towards the Moon administration, and it's already divided enough, not just as a whole, but even amongst supporters of the Democratic Party. So I think that's why they're paying even more attention to being careful and sort of watching where they're stepping.
I think it's a really interesting observation you make, Ian, that the Democratic Party lost. And I think personally that's the correct take, because they had the majority, they had the mandate. The Conservative Party were dead and buried, and yet somehow they contrived to lose this. Even with President Moon's popularity, he's got some devout supporters and his popularity was still, but even that wasn't enough. And like you say, Lee Jae-myung distanced himself. Perhaps Lee Na-kyun might have won. I think the Choguk one was the big thing.
Yeah, that was definitely a very big blow.
There was the appointed successor, I think. There was this handsome, smart, relatively young man that was going to come in, be the Minister of Justice, then perhaps the president, and that was going to be that. But President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol investigated, and we've seen how that all plays out. And I'm sure people probably know this, but for those that don't, but then President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol was handpicked by President Moon. To be the special. Shihan, it's all like a Maktang drama, really, isn't it? We've done nearly like 3 hours, but we still haven't got to the bottom of Korean politics. We'll definitely do a follow-up on this, I think, at some point. But you're right, the elections continue. I'm pretty positive about the future because of people like you and people that I talk to. Let's I'll ask you a couple more questions as we try to wrap this up, Si-hoon. Just imagine for me, you have power, fiat to do anything regarding Korean politics. And this doesn't mean like, oh, I can't do that because that would never work or the people wouldn't agree with it. Let's just say like you can do the Thanos snap or something, right? Yeah. It's a ridiculous question, but what is it that you would do? There's one thing that you can do to either affect Korean politics, change society. I mean, where would your interest be? What would it be that you think would have the greatest effect? Either for good or bad. You can be Thanos if you want in this situation. It doesn't bomb Japan. I don't. But you have power and fiat to do one thing vis-a-vis Korean politics. What is it, do you think?
I would say. I would say the potential solution, and this might be very controversial. I mean, I have no idea if it's actually going to work, but finding some way to unify with North Korea, I think that might actually provide a lot of the things that Korea needs right now, moving forward. In the sense that, number one, there's the obvious economic advantages of having a larger country, a larger population, and North Korea also has more natural resources,
cheap labor.
I mean, and it would also open up borders somewhat as well, I would imagine. But at the same time, politically speaking, I think it would also unify the Korean people a lot more if we have that task that we need to focus on. Because I think one of the things that right now, one of the reasons why Korea is so divided is that we don't have a single mission that we all agree we need to accomplish, that we need to focus on, as we used to have in the past with like economic growth and democratization. We had those goals, the people had those goals that they all agreed, we need to focus on this, we need to get this done for our country to move forward. Now that we've kind of moved past all of that, we're sort of stuck in this awkward phase of our country's history where possibly for the first time, we don't really know what we need to do to move forward. And I think obviously some people consider the next main mission to be normalizing relations with North Korea, possibly even unification. That was definitely, maybe not to the extent of unification, but normalizing relations was definitely one of the main goals of the Moon administration. Um, and I think once we can achieve that, if we can achieve, obviously the main difficulty is whether or not we can achieve that with a dictator in North Korea. But if we can achieve that, we would be able to, I would imagine, basically have that as our next goal, where we're working with former North Koreans, if we're able to unify to kind of rebuild North Korea, to rebuild the Korean country. I guess it wouldn't be called South and North Korea anymore, as a unified country, and really establish ourselves in the region as well as internationally.
Call it Samsung. I'm only half joking, but I made a point about the cheap labor, but the infrastructure, the development. There is a reason that President Moon took the heads of the chaebol up to Baekdusan when he visited, and things like that. He was trying to show that. I think this has been a dream of many people. I do hear talk that I do hear talk of China taking North Korea as a solution, which would also open up borders in certain ways, because you would, one of the Kim Dae-jung and President Moon policies was about the trains and getting them to be able to go through. Can't really go through Russia at the moment, so that plan is complete. But the idea that you could connect to the mainland and have those, China taking North Korea would have been one of the ideas, because a lot of the media attention is on China taking Taiwan, but Taiwan's a democracy far away, and you need amphibious operations to get and take that. China and North Korea are connected. There's people going back and forward. A lot easier. But then what does South Korea have to say about that?
South Koreans wouldn't like that too much.
No, I don't think they would. It's a situation that I sometimes explore in my lectures on North Korea, and I've done a lot of research on it. Honik Kwon is one of the Korean scholars that puts this forward, that the Cold War didn't end on the Korean peninsula. For most of Eastern Europe, the borders were redrawn, there were new nations founded, ideologies changed, but that hasn't happened yet here. The system that was put in place in 1945 and the establishment in 1948 of the two Koreas, that's still in place. There has been no fall of the wall or David Hasselhoff in leather pants singing songs. You probably don't know who David Hasselhoff is, do you?
I do.
You do? You do? How do you know who David Hasselhoff is?
I mean, he actually he came out. I guess he didn't come out, but he was referred to in Guardians of the Galaxy.
Okay. Oh,
so.
Well done, Guardians. So we've done Thanos and we've done Guardians of the Galaxy, getting our cultural references in. We could probably talk about North Korea for another 3 hours as well, right? But just looking to the future, Shihoon, you're already doing so much at a young age, and it's been fantastic talking to you. What does the future hold? Are you going to be president in 30 years? Are you going into politics? Are you going to be an e-gamer, or I don't know. What happens in your future?
Well, I think there's definitely a certain level of uncertainty towards the future. I think, especially for a lot of people, a lot of current students, just because we grew up basically with teachers and the media telling us 90% of jobs are going to be taken over by AI by the time you're grown up. So it's kind of a question of, okay, then what will be left for us to do? But I know a lot of my friends, and I think myself included, what we're really looking towards is as being sort of the next doctor, the next lawyer, like some of those professions that people would kind of say or I guess like maybe in Western culture, I think there's also like being a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon, those
Mm,
kind of professions.
mm,
I think it's really the next thing is uh, being an entrepreneur, essentially. Just because we grew up basically looking at people like Elon Musk with Tesla and SpaceX, and uh, I think that's really the direction that I think a lot of students and young people are headed towards, because it's no longer about picking one subject area or picking one specific profession and pursuing that path. It's Now it's sort of a fusion between
mm.
different areas of knowledge and areas of professions. Like it's not good enough to just be a doctor or just be a lawyer. You kind of need to mix and match between different areas. Oftentimes, areas that may not even necessarily appear to match all that well in on the surface level. Um, so I think that's definitely one direction, but I mean, I am interested in politics as well,
Mm.
and interested in social issues and what's going on in the world. So I definitely do think um, I don't know if I'll end up as a politician, um, especially in Korea. Maybe I'll see what happens to President Moon first. but but I think, yeah, I think I'll definitely remain kind of very interested, and I think just my nature and my personality, I think I'll be drawn to politics even if I don't, if even if I choose another profession.
When I spoke to Dr. Bong Young-shik about politics, I've had dinner with him since and things like that. His father was a politician, and I asked him, like, Young-shik, Dr. Bong, like, what about politics? And he said, I'm not the right personality. Like,
Mm.
do you know what I mean? There are certain
Yeah.
personalities. It's not always about knowledge, but he was like, I think he knew the strain it would take on him
Mm.
if he were to do that. You mentioned the future. You mentioned Elon Musk and things like this, right? Who's recently bought Twitter. It would say like
Yes.
44 billion.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this, he tweeted out and said, the next thing I'm going to do is buy Coca-Cola and put cocaine back in it.
Yeah. Put Coke back in. Yeah.
He's just a wum, isn't he? It's amazing. And so, but there's a serious question here that I want to ask you, which is about the future and about the vision of the future, because it seems to me that we're living out the vision of the future that was created in the 80s and the 90s and
Mhm.
these kind of things. All this is like, Star Trek and things like this.
Yeah.
It's the future that we're living has already been imagined, but one of the questions I sometimes try to put to young people is, what does the future look like? I mean, not our future, but your future. And they might say something like, oh, flying cars. And I'm like, yeah, but that's Back to the Future. I mean, is there another future? Is there a future that you can envisage that's not yet been envisaged? And I think Elon Musk is somebody that does something like that. Actually,
Yeah.
he views things that are not in our current paradigm, and he looks forward. And whatever your take on his Twitter conversations or personality might be otherwise, I respect him for the
Mm.
fact that he views things outside the current paradigm.
Yes.
I don't expect you to be like Elon Musk, Sihyun, but like, what does the future look like? If you understand the context of that question, is there a future that you can envisage?
Um, I think there are different ways of looking at the future. Obviously, it depends on your perspective. It depends on the level of optimism or pessimism that you have.
Yeah.
Um, I think personally, I'm someone who thinks that I said earlier, we kind of grew up with people saying, AIs are going to take over basically the world. I'm personally someone who doesn't think that's actually going to end up happening.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of the things that that's going on right now, especially in terms of, so if we're looking at it globally, relationships between countries, uh, like intergovernmental projects or initiatives, and like organizations like the UN. I think all of those things are really going to change very dramatically by the time we're grown up. Um, and the reason now, I'm not entirely sure how it's going to change. Um, but I do think that it will change, and the reason for that is because I think humanity is, um, I think something that makes every sort of generation and every um, group of people that make up what we call humanity at any given point in time very different, at different points in time, in different places, is the fact that we have different values and that we have different ideas. So this was actually something that I was talking about with one of my friends recently was, is there really an absolute sort of idea of this is justice, or this is, morally correct. This is what we should absolutely strive towards as humanity. And personally, I thought that there wasn't really an absolute truth or an absolute justice. And the reason for that, I think, is because, we're constantly changing, and change doesn't necessarily mean that we're constantly developing or that we're progressing towards something. It just means that we're different, and that we have different ideas and different perspectives than what we used to have. So I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think we need to improve our values. More so, we need to constantly be open to change and open to different ideas. And I think so the example I gave was, going back a few hundred years, slavery was very prominent in many cultures, especially in Western culture. And so was colonialism. And a lot of times those acts that we would consider to be very immoral and unjustifiable now were justified back then to a certain extent. And who knows what people 50 years from now, or even 100 years from now, are going to be thinking about what we're doing right now that we might consider to be completely normal and fine, but they're like, no, like people in the 21st century were really immoral, and they were, very outdated for thinking that way. And then you also never really know what ideas might make a comeback. I think it's sort of like the games that I was talking about earlier. It's, to a certain extent, it's quite arbitrary, and it's random which ideas are popular at different times. Some ideas make a comeback, some ideas just kind of die away after some time. So I think it's not so much about striving towards a future that we can imagine. And I think that actually, I feel like I'm in some ways avoiding the question, but
it's a difficult
think,
one.
Yeah. I think your question itself is sort of the answer to what's going to happen in the future, is that it's not going to be something we can imagine right now. And if it is something we can imagine right now, it's probably not what's actually going to end up happening. Just because we're constantly changing. So no matter what, as people living in this current time and age, even Elon Musk, who, definitely does think much more outside the box than a lot of other people, he's still thinking within what he knows and what he thinks as a person living in the 21st century in 2022. And that limits it somewhat. So I think it's a question that, can really only be answered once we get to that point. Like if we ask someone in 1950, what do you think is going to be happening in 2022? They probably wouldn't be able to answer. And I think if we were to ask someone in 2021, like last year, I think they would still have just as hard a time answering what's going to happen in 2022 as the person from 1950. So yeah.
So you're more of a Hegelian or a Marxist than a Plato or a Platonist that has these, big abstract theories. I don't say that with any disrespect, by the way.
Yeah.
It's okay to be a Marxist sometimes if you're talking about historical dialects. Just don't let your parents hear you say that I said that. No, but you're right that we don't know the future because we can't put ourselves into that consciousness. I guess the reason I asked it is, you're right, and there are so many different approaches, but the cultural critic Mark Fisher sort of said that he had this idea, which I'm a little bit fascinated by, that it might just be because I'm a bit old and cynical, which is why I talk to young people like you, Si-Hoon, is that we're just living out 20th century content on 21st century devices, that we're still listening to Coldplay and hip hop and rap, and it's all the old stuff, but the technology is improving, but what we're doing isn't. We're still kind of stuck because of neoliberalism and we hear, but you are the future. And in that sense, let me ask you this final question, and it's been fascinating to talk to you. I've really, just before we finish, Si-Hoon, I will say that I think we could have explored so many more of these conversations, the one about gender equality and the ministry of that, North Korea politics. We could have gone even deeper into all of those for many hours, I think. So we'll have to do a follow-up at some point. You've said that there are no perhaps ultimate values of justice or truth, and that change is that. In that context, this last question then, Si-Hoon, which I've asked to many of my guests, we're all in this world together, and whether we asked to be or not, but now that we are here, what can we do to give our lives more value? What can we do to give meaning to the people around us? What is the meaning of life, Si-Hoon?
I think the meaning of life is ultimately leaving some sort of positive impact. I think I would say that's sort of really the ultimate goal. And I think, obviously the best way to do that is by taking action and by actually going out in the world and sort of not being afraid to engage in conversations, engage in different activities, meet new people. And I think it's really something important for many people to realize that oftentimes we think of, historical figures as being, like kings and queens and like dictators, people who are beyond, to a certain extent, the realm of the average citizen or the average person. But I think increasingly that's no longer the case. You can be an average person, like an average high school student in Korea, and still have a significant historical impact or leave some sort of impact. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be historical. For example, if you're working at some company and you help to establish some new idea or new project that really ends up making the company very popular or very successful, that's a very big impact as well. And there's a million other ways that you can do that. And I think it's kind of going back to there's something my grandfather once told me, which is that there are basically two ways that you can impact history. And the first way is by being the first to do something. And the second way is being the greatest at something. And I think that's really, if we think about it, those two things are both, very easy things to do to a certain extent, as long as we put our mind to it and as long as we really dedicate ourselves to it. That's exactly what that thousands and like even millions of people do every day, everywhere in the world. You don't have to be the president of a country. You don't have to be like a Olympic athlete with 5 gold medals to be historically significant or to be socially significant. I think probably the best example I can come up with right now is Greta Thunberg, who's like in basically every way a normal person, who and is continuing to have a very significant impact in the world, because she decided to have this protest for what she believed in, and it ended up being recognized by different people. So I think, and it's Greta Thunberg who did that, but it could have just as easily been anyone else doing that exact same thing, as long as they had that idea and they put their minds to it. So I think that's really the meaning of life, is finding something that you really care about. And sometimes it can come by accident. It doesn't have to be something that you consciously search for and you have to recognize it as your passion. I think sometimes, a lot of people, they realize after they've already been doing something for a long time, oh wait, this was my passion. This is what I'm passionate about. So I think just realizing that and actually putting your mind to it so that you, don't just follow what everyone else is doing, but you actually, even if it's a small difference, find some way to make it unique. That's the first criteria. You're the first person to do it. And find some way to really excel at whatever it is you're doing. And that would fit the second criteria.
You've inspired me, Sihun. Thank you. I mean, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be something that it generates money or success or popularity. You might be the first person to say hello to the old lady on the subway that hasn't spoken to someone for a long time. It can be a very small thing, but you can impact people's lives in those ways. I agree with you. We don't need to be big people to do those things. It's great talking to you, Sihun. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.